They weren't exactly working together, but now that Velik knew Torwin was nearby, his apex hunter instinct stopped flaring up every time the old man came within a mile. They operated on opposing schedules. Velik thrived under moonlight, taking full advantage of his racial subtype and prowling the night like a shadow. Torwin, by contrast, was a dawn riser. Their overlap was brief at best, just enough for a few grunted updates and the occasional sarcastic exchange. One such exchange came just before dawn, as Velik prepared to find shelter and Torwin tightened his boots for a long trek. "Does the bonus really make it worth it?" Torwin asked, eyeing the still dark horizon. "I've been trudging through monster-infested terrain half-blind, trying to match your pace. It's a damn headache." Velik shrugged, not looking up. "I'm half again as strong and fast at night, and I see just fine in the dark." "Half again?" Torwin raised a brow. "That's absurd. No racial subtype gives bonuses that high. I don't make the rules. I just reap the benefits." Torwin groaned. "Morgus, save me. No wonder you move like a ghost." "All right, here's the plan then. You work nights, I'll chase your trail during the day. If we keep our compasses synced, we'll leapfrog through these champion seeds and clear the whole mess out." Velik nodded. Efficient. Minimal talking. Zero unnecessary contact. Perfect. He didn't trust Torwin. The man was competent, sure. Friendly, even. But he wanted something. Velik couldn't pin down what, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. He'd learned the hard way that trust was a luxury, and betrayal rarely came from strangers. Still, time was short. If champions kept spawning unchecked, hordes would form. Towns would burn. Velik didn't have the luxury of paranoia right now. Besides, the plan required almost no interaction, and Jensen, Torwin's overeager apprentice, was blissfully far away. "I'm turning in for a few hours," Velik said. "Good luck with the next one." "Appreciate it," Torwin replied. "Want to keep watch?" Velik snorted. Torwin chuckled. "Yeah, didn't think so. You've probably been doing this longer than I've been alive. Sleep tight, Shadow Prince." Torwin shook his head as he walked away. At Velik's age, he'd barely graduated to junior hunter, still trembling at every twig snap during night watch, even surrounded by a full team. Velik, by contrast, bedded down solo in a monster-infested forest like it was a bedroll on a tavern floor. It was impressive, maybe even a little sad. Torwin suspected Velik had some variant of Ranger's foresight, something that warned him moments before danger struck. That, or the kid's instincts were simply honed to a razor's edge from living alone in the deep wood for years. Focusing on his compass, Torwin tweaked the filtering crystals, ensuring it remained perfectly aligned with Velik's. As long as they stayed within 100 miles of each other, they'd be hunting the same targets. Velik had clearly been busy. The woods were littered with signs of cleanup, fresh kill sites, monster trails that ended in silence. Anything Torwin ran into now was probably new, drifting into the vacuum left behind. Still, the infestation was larger than he'd expected. As if to emphasize the point, a pair of cerebral wolves slinked from the underbrush, each with 3 snarling heads and muscle rippling under thick pelts. Torwin didn't hesitate. With practiced precision, he knocked an arrow and activated Hailstrike, sending a barrage of concussive shots slamming into the beasts. Each impact burst with bone-jarring force, shattering their bodies before they could react. "You have slain a cerebral wolf, level 35. You have slain a cerebral wolf, level 38. You have been awarded 3 dekarmas." Mid-30s? This close to town? Torwin frowned. If this really started with that kid finding a dungeon seed, this situation's worse than I thought. At least his new gear was proving its worth. The endless arrows Bracer Jensen had talked him into his pulling its weight. It was pricier than a small army's worth of arrows, but the convenience, especially deep in hostile territory, was undeniable. His mystical stat was a limiting factor, though. The Bracer couldn't conjure arrows as fast as he could shoot. So for now, he alternated Magic 1, Quiver 1, Magic 1. Slow, but sustainable. Maybe he'd get the Bracer enchanted to boost his mystical stat later. After several hours of travel, Torwin crested a ridge and spotted something strange. A field of wildflowers. out of place in the shifting season. Summer had already begun yielding to autumn, but this patch was still blooming like spring. He squinted. Mana's thick here. Compass points right at it. Champion Arena. Torwin had cleared enough dungeons to know the signs. Champions weren't just stronger, they controlled their battlefield. Enchanted terrain, summoned minions, battlefield effects. Nothing was off limits. He stepped carefully to the edge, studying the wind's pattern across the petals. Some kind of nature type? Insects? Maybe even a fae or dryad. You're stalling. He scolded himself. If the kid can do this solo at his level, so can you. You have entered the domain of a champion elite. Algorex, the bloodroot. Plant type confirmed. Torwin stepped into the flowers and immediately cursed. Pollen burst into the air in choking clouds. He lunged forward, knowing a trap when he saw one. 10 feet in, the air shimmered. A containment field, just as expected. No escape now. Smart setup, he thought. No walls, just barriers and triggers. Gonna be one of those fights. From the earth ahead, the champion emerged. A 20-foot mound of sentient dirt rose up, thick roots writhing around it like tentacles. Torwin didn't flinch. He leapt, drew, and loosed in one fluid motion. Hail strike flared, detonating on impact and revealing a gash of raw plant flesh. It sealed moments later, vines stitching it shut like a living scar. Then came the bees. Dozens, no, hundreds, each the size of his thumb. The air buzzed with their furious wing beats. Torwin grinned, forming another arrow and imbuing it with splinter shot. A flick of his fingers added shrapnel on top. The resulting blast turned 30 bees into mulch. He hit the champion again and again, 8 times before his boots hit the ground. More pollen clouds erupted around him, but he was gone, a blur weaving through petals and buzzing wings. Laughing to himself, Torwin reached for the next arrow. Yeah, he thought, already lining up the next shot. I get it now, Velik. This is fun. The moment Velik's eyes snapped open, his hand reached for the compass. Last night, it had been pointing northwest. Now, directly north. Torwin must have taken care of that one. Good. Their leapfrog plan was holding together, at least in theory. But a new complication quickly became apparent. Until the compass shifted to a new direction, Velik wouldn't know whether Torwin had already engaged the next champion. He could be mid-fight right now, or hours away. If the compass didn't update until after the fight, Velik could waste precious time heading toward the same destination, only to find the job already done. That wouldn't be the end of the world, just a few hours lost, but it was inefficient, and inefficiency grated at him. Still, nothing I can do about it until the needle moves again. The compass didn't detect proximity. It simply filtered for intensity and focus. Until the current signal disappeared, the next wouldn't even show. And with 6 long hours until dusk, Velik was left with only one productive option. Time to kill monsters. Maybe he'd nudge Spear Warden closer to the next rank. Or, if he was lucky, maybe Phalanx would merge into it. That would be useful. Unlikely, given how recently he acquired it, but not impossible. Most likely, though, Kinetic Charge would tick up next. He used it in every fight now. It had started off with fast progression, but lately, it felt like he'd squeezed all it had to offer from it. It'd be nice if it merged into Spear Warden already. Free up a skill slot. One less thing to manage. The afternoon passed in a blur of motion and combat. He diverted from the most direct path to chase down monsters, zigzagging across a jagged line of travel that more than doubled his distance. By the time the sun began its descent, he'd taken out several hundred monsters. The local monster population had stabilized, their levels averaging in the mid-30s, challenging but not unmanageable. That eased one of Velik's major concerns. He was already fighting enemies a few levels above him. If champions started spiking into the 40s, it could mean fights where retreat wasn't just risky, it was a trap. Champions couldn't leave their designated domains. That gave Velik a sliver of confidence, even in tough battles. If things got bad, he could disengage and regroup. They weren't like wild monsters that chased prey for miles, unwilling to give up the hunt. Not that he'd had to run from anything in years. The last time had been when he was 12. He'd wedged his spear between the armor plates of a stoneback monitor lizard, only for the tip to snap clean off. He could have stayed and finished the job, but not without taking a serious hit. And, at the time, he didn't have a spare 1,000 dekarmos for a healing potion. So he ran. He didn't regret it. He was 3 hours into today's circuit when the compass needle twitched. East. Velik let out a quiet sigh. Knew that was going to happen eventually. Torwin must have gotten to the previous target. Still, it hadn't been a waste. 800 dekarmos richer, closer to another skill rank, and no sign of rising threat levels. He backtracked a quarter-mile to a game trail and veered east. It would have been nice if the compass showed distance. He had no way of knowing if he was closer to the next target than Torwin was, and he had no intention of arriving late again. The sun slipped behind the trees, painting the forest floor with long ribbons of shadow and firelight. Twilight had come, and with it, Velik's power surged. Duskbound, activated, strength humming through his limbs like lightning through iron. This was his time. He was close. The champion's aura would start brushing against his senses any moment now. Then something strange happened. The compass needle shifted, just slightly, a few degrees. Torwin must have killed it, Velik thought. Next one's almost directly behind it. But then the needle moved again. Velik froze. It twisted north, then twitched west, then east again. What the hell? He watched it dance, just a few degrees back and forth, like it couldn't make up its mind. That wasn't normal. Not unless the source was moving. He frowned. It hadn't happened since he refined his filters. But if this was a mobile elite, something unbound, powerful, and smart, then it made sense. And now Velik was irritated. His first kill of the night was shaping up to be just another elite. He tracked the signal deeper into the woods. The silence was eerie. No birds, no rustling. Just his own breath and the soft hum of the compass. After 10 minutes of running, realization dawned. It's a hunter, just like me. The predator wasn't just hiding. It was actively stalking. Smart. Dangerous. Great. The only way this could get more annoying is if Torwin drops an arrow into its skull right as I reach it. The trees began to thin. The forest gave way to sparse woodland, wide enough for a cart to pass. For Velik, it was as easy as walking down a road. He jogged forward, mind flicking between Apex Hunter and the compass needle, trying to keep a bead on the elusive target. Where are you? I should have sensed you by now. A small voice in his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he'd overestimated his advantage. What if this wasn't a normal elite? What if it was powerful enough to match Torwin? That didn't happen often, but he'd seen stranger things. The champions had been distributed randomly, as far as he could tell. But elites? Those could be placed, guided. What if this one's guarding something? If so, it might be his first real clue. Maybe even a link to Chalin, or whoever was behind the recent spike in monster activity. His fingers tightened around his spear. All right then, let's see what you're hiding. If the elite was guarding something important, it'd stay close. That was good. It meant Velik wouldn't need to scour the whole forest. He briefly entertained the idea of catching a live to keep the compass needle fixed, make it easier for Torwin to find him. Not the worst idea, if it was doable. His thoughts trailed off as the compass finally steadied. Either it had stopped, or it was moving directly away, but hadn't reacted to his approach, and unless it had supernatural senses and speed, it hadn't noticed him yet. Probably just feeding. Velik crouched low, Apex Hunter, sharpening his awareness. Then a message appeared. You have entered the domain of a champion elite. Velik, the Black Fang. He blinked. Wait, what?
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Velik froze in place and peered around, half expecting his doppelganger to jump out from behind a tree and run him through. When that didn't immediately happen, he took a cautious step into the champion's domain. Usually, the monster announced its presence right away, with the only exception he knew of being that spider that had been a speedy ambush specialist. What if this thing mirrors my own abilities? Apex Hunter folded stealth into itself. Maybe it's stalking me. That was an alarming line of reasoning, if only because he doubted that the monster would also mimic his equipment and that it wouldn't compensate in some other way. Thus far, he'd defeated every champion he'd come up against. By that logic, he was stronger than them. If this champion mimicked his stats, then it was the most powerful creature he'd ever faced. That was a surprisingly sobering thought to contemplate. But this all supposes I'm right about something pretending to be me in this domain. And can it make a system message do that? Shouldn't it say what the monster's really called? He figured he'd find out soon enough. Whether the monster was his twin or not, it would attack him eventually, and probably in the next minute. He strode through the trees, spear in hand, and eye flicking between the twilight shadows. There were 1,000 places a human could hide in any forest, and with trees so big that their trunks were 3 feet wide, it was as easy as simply stepping behind one in this place. The soft, scraping sound of dried leaves being dragged across the ground came to him, and Velik spun to face that direction. For a moment, he imagined it to be a stray breeze rustling the detritus around a thin tree, but he immediately realized his mistake. That's not a tree. It's got fur on it. It's a leg the size of a tree. What the? It was the sleek, short black fur that confused him, so solid that in the evening shadows, it had taken him a moment to sort out that it wasn't just a smooth-bored tree. His eyes followed the limb up to a massive chest, easily 20 feet off the ground and covered with a much thicker ruff. The monster padded forward a step, coming out from behind the tree far enough for Velik to see its other leg. How the fuck is that me? It was a great wolf, 4 times his height and probably 20 times his weight. Its eyes glowed red in the shadows, and its mouth hung open to reveal teeth longer than his forearm. Those teeth were like shards of obsidian darkness, gleaming in the dying light. Well, I get the Black Fang part, at least. Makes more sense than it ever did for me. The wolf's massive head swung around to peer at Velik, and its lips peeled back. A low growl rumbled through the air, so heavy that it shook tree branches and vibrated through Velik's chest. He didn't need to glance down at the compass held in his left hand to confirm that the needle was pointing right at this monster. Instead, he slipped it into his pocket, spared a moment to hope he didn't break this one, and took up his spear in both hands. Hunter and monster, the Black Fang and the Black Fang, regarded each other silently. The wolf was easily the largest monster he'd ever seen, and Apex Hunter didn't like his odds of victory. There was no doubt it was over level 40. The smart thing to do was to run. He was only a few feet from the edge of the champion's domain. The creak of splitting timber filled the air as the wolf shouldered a tree aside and crouched low. Crimson eyes stared down at him, and Velik found a strange sense of kinship in that gaze. They were 2 predators who could not share anything, not a territory, and certainly not a name. Thomas settled who's really worthy of the title. Don't you think? He asked as he took a step forward. He blurred forward, his spear leading the way and kinetic charge, primed to release a devastating opener. Halfway there, he slipped sideways just in time to avoid being crushed under a massive paw, then twisted into a jump that threw his legs out to keep him in the air above the nails that swiped sideways. His spear flicked out, a metal tongue with a razor edge, and scored a line of black blood through the thick fur. His feet were back under him before he even started to come back down, but that wasn't enough to save him. Quick as a flash, the wolf's paw swung back the other way. It smacked into him like a runaway wagon and threw him through the air. Velik tumbled end over end in 3 complete circuits before he even hit the dirt 30 feet away. Fucking ow! Apex Hunter screamed at him to move, and Velik didn't stop to question that. He threw himself into a roll that ended behind a tree just in time to avoid a lunging bite from the wolf's great maw. Its obsidian teeth smacked closed around the tree, crunching through it with no discernible effort and ripping out a mouthful. The remainder wasn't strong enough to support the tree's weight, leaving Velik to scramble out from under it before it toppled over and crushed him. He jabbed his spear out, finally releasing kinetic charge, and drove it into the wolf's snout before it could recover from its missed bite. It flinched back, a somewhat incongruous movement on such a large monster, but Velik knew it was more from the surprise sting than from being injured. They split apart, both eyeing the other warily, and with a bit more respect, now that they'd begun to take each other's measure. The wolf was every bit as strong as Velik had suspected it would be, and surprisingly agile on top of that. It was vicious and aggressive, more than willing to take a hit to dish one out. If it got its jaws around him, that would probably be the end of the fight, which put Velik in the awkward position of needing to either end the fight in a quick, decisive blow, or giving his counterpart the slow death of 1,000 cuts while fighting defensively. I'm not even sure I have a real choice. Even with kinetic charge, I'm having trouble actually cutting through it. That hit to the paw was barely a scratch. His one advantage was that this arena favored him. That ran counter to what he knew about champions, but he wasn't going to complain about the other Black Fang having a handicap. It was too big to easily move through the trees, and he was every bit as fast as the monster, which gave him the edge in mobility. Velik darted through the shadows, seeking to lead the wolf on a chase where it would get itself stuck, even if only for a moment. Pushing over a tree wasn't easy, not even for something close to 30 feet tall, and if it gave him an opening, Velik was going to take it. He led it on a chase through the trees, but the wolf was smart enough not to wedge itself where it couldn't fit. It pursued him, all snapping jaws and savage nails raking deep gouges in the dirt as he dodged out of the way. The more they fought, the better a feel Velik got for its tactics and abilities. I can win this. Just be patient. Don't make mistakes. That was what he thought until the third time he looped around one particularly huge specimen of a tree. It was easily 8 feet wide, big enough that not even the champion elite could knock it over. He must have frustrated his opponent, but it suddenly shifted focus. Instead of attacking Velik, it raked its nails across the tree's bole and left a line of burning acid scoring the bark. It hissed and popped as it ate through the wood, and when the acid fizzled out a few seconds later, the tree had a noticeable chunk burned out of it. A few more hits like that might be enough to bring even it down. Was that Venom Slash? It even has access to the same selection of class skills as me. There were dozens of skills for the Black Fang, and Velik assumed his counterpart had at least 5 skill slots. Not even looking at what it might have merged together, he could think of at least 3 other skills off the top of his head that he had no interest in being the target of. A second, Venom Slash scored the tree, prompting Velik to flee around its bulk. His spear trailed behind him, its head sharpened to a slashing edge and whipping around in a smooth arc the instant he sensed the wolf pivot to lunge at him. The wolf caught it between 2 teeth, jerking Velik to a halt and forcing him to either abandon the weapon or let himself get pinned. Neither was an acceptable option, so he created a new one. Phalanx roared to life, for phantasmal spears appearing to surround him. They wouldn't be strong enough to block an attack, not from this champion, but they were flashy enough that when they dove straight for the wolf's eyes, it jerked backwards. Unfortunately, it didn't release the spear from its jaws. Velik tried to twist it to drag across vulnerable flesh, but the teeth clamped down on it were too tight. Giving that up, he activated the weapon's shape, shifting to thin the head down in an attempt to slip it free. That worked, but he knew he was in trouble the moment he took his first step away. One of the wolf's front paws was just to his left. Its teeth were feet from him. Its hot breath rolled across his face. His phantasmal spears failed to penetrate even the relatively soft mass of the wolf's eyes, and Velik recognized the distinctive muscular pop of a familiar skill activating. Before he could so much as take a second step, the wolf used Serpent Strike. Its neck stretched forward, jaws open, and its teeth closed down on Velik. Velik threw himself backward in a desperate attempt to avoid being snapped up by the giant wolf, but it was a futile gesture. The power of Serpent Strike was in its lunging speed, and there was really only one thing he could do at this point. He tucked his arms and legs in close, and led with his spear when the jaws closed around him. The fading light cut out, not that Velik needed that to see. The wolf's tongue pushed up against him, a massive, wet muscle that was trying to shove him between its teeth. His spear shot out, one part momentum and one part shape-shifting, helping keep it manageable in the tight space and pin the tongue down. Despite his physical being over 100 now, he was surprised to find that it took all of his strength to keep from being forced sideways. Even as he wrestled with it, teeth opened and closed, the wolf's jaw shifted back and forth, and hot, fetid breath assaulted his senses. If I could get this spear free, I could kill this damn monster right now, he thought, but he knew that was wishful thinking. The second he pulled the blade back, the tongue would slam him into the teeth, and he'd be torn to pieces. It was the only piece of leverage he had to hold his position, however disgusting that might be. But his spear wasn't his only weapon, not anymore. He had a class skill he was betting the wolf hadn't taken. Phalanx blazed to life around him, for spears of magical energy coalescing to stab out at the soft palate above him or into the wolf's gums. They weren't made for this, and a shifting of its jaws broke them apart, but the wounds they scored remained. Velik summoned the phantasmal spears again and again, each time stabbing them into vulnerable flesh while he struggled with the tongue. The wolf's jaws parted, and it gave up trying to chew on him. Its head whipped back and forth in an attempt to dislodge him and send him flying. Bit off more than you could chew, huh? Well, tough luck for you. Getting stuck in the champion's mouth wasn't something he'd planned on, but now that he was past the teeth, he wasn't leaving until he found a way to puncture its brain. Phalanx was slowly draining the magic out of him, but he kept hammering away at the same spot, tearing more flesh and filling the mouth with black blood. His control was shaky, and he couldn't maintain them for very long, but considering the circumstances and what he was trying to do, he thought he was doing a hell of a job. Even when his leg slipped and smacked into a razor-edged tooth, drawing a hot line of blood down his calf, he never lost focus. It's still not enough. Damn you, break already. It's just like when I was fighting those monsters before I got kinetic charge to help me puncture their hides. Wait, could that work? The skill was supposed to build up energy, and the phantasmal spears didn't last long enough for that, but there was nothing saying the energy had to come from swinging the weapon around. He was burning plenty of that just holding the tongue in place, so it couldn't eject him. He only made one spear with Phalanx this time. That way, he could devote the entirety of his mental to controlling it. In theory, it might be slightly stronger than normal this way, but he wasn't sure about that. He'd tried to test it, but he'd never been able to detect an appreciable difference, despite the logic behind how the skill worked implying that it would be. Mental measured how well he could control the spear. Mystic measured how much magic could be put into it. If he only made one spear, that meant more magic got focused into it. Somehow, the theory didn't seem to match reality. Not important right now. Focus on what you're doing. With his mental grip on the spear firm, he activated kinetic charge. Instead of drawing from the momentum of the unmoving construct, he used his own limbs. One forearm was braced against the top of the wolf's mouth, while the spear was firmly gripped in his other hand and held against his chest to keep it stable. His injured leg pushed down on the tongue to keep it from wagging too much, and his other foot was locked perilously close to one of its teeth. All of that took strength to hold, and he channeled some of that energy into the phantasmal spear he'd built with Phalanx. The construct shuddered in place, jerking so hard that he almost lost hold of it. For a moment, Velik was ready to start cursing, but then the whole thing stabilized. Kinetic charge has advanced to rank 4. No time for hesitation, he thought. The spear shot forward, many times faster than normal, and buried itself deep in the back of the wolf's soft palate. The wolf jerked in place once, then went still. Woozily, it shook its head, but there was none of the ferocity it had displayed just moments earlier. It took a hesitant, staggering step, then a second one. Come on, die. Just fall over dead. This fight is over. I pierced your brain. But that didn't happen. With startling quickness, the wolf's neck muscles twisted and it slammed its face into a tree. The impact jolted Velik free of where he'd wedged himself and hurled him to the ground, fresh gashes across his body and his spear left behind in the wolf's tongue. Velik rolled twice to absorb the momentum and came to his feet. The wolf hadn't pursued him, hadn't moved at all from where it was leaning its flank against a tree twice as tall as it was. The tree groaned against the weight, but held. "How the hell are you still alive?" he asked the champion monster. In response, it stuck its tongue out to reveal his spear, then very deliberately dragged it across its teeth until the half caught and the weapon was pulled free. Looking Velik directly in the eyes, it bit down with a crunch, then spit the 2 pieces of the spear out. "Son of a bitch. Mending was a powerful enchantment, but Velik wasn't sure it could fix that. Maybe if he recovered both pieces and splinted them together, it might regrow a connection. It wouldn't matter if he didn't win this fight. And to do that, he needed a weapon. A new phantasmal spear materialized in the air next to him, but rather than direct it with his mind, he reached out and grabbed it. With his other hand, he pulled out a healing potion, popped the cork, and swallowed it. Immediately, his wounds started to close. Ready for round 2? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Torwin scratched lazily at his cheek and considered what he was feeling. He'd folded Mana Sense into Ranger's lore a long time ago, mostly as a way to give himself a heads up when monsters used skills that relied heavily on Mystic, but it served a secondary purpose that rarely came into play. Some people built whole classes around finding stuff like this with detection skills that had ranges measured in miles. His version went out maybe 50 feet and was partially dependent on his line of sight. He could sense flickers of mana in his peripheral vision, but it was only when he focused on it directly that he could sort out what he was seeing. And here, in an incredible stroke of luck, he was seeing what appeared to be an apple the color of blood made out of solid crystal. "What do you do?" he asked the fruit. "A point or two to a stat, perhaps? Or something rarer? Maybe knowledge to boost a skill? Or ease a merger? Well, whatever it is, I'm sure someone will pay quite a bit for the privilege of eating you." He plucked the apple free of the tree and spent a few minutes scouring the area, just in case there was a second one. It wasn't that he expected to find it, not as rare as these sorts of treasures were, but it would be criminally negligent not to look. As expected, the fruit was entirely unique. Whistling a jaunty tune, he pulled the compass back out and oriented himself. "Wonder how the kid's doing. I was kind of expecting the signal to shift as soon as it got dark. Maybe whatever he's hunting is giving him some trouble." If it were Jensen out there, Torwin would be rushing toward the next target at top speed, but he trusted Velik to handle himself. Besides, Torwin had already killed 3 champions in one day, which was impressive enough by anyone's standards. Velik could have this one. Torwin would be looking for a place to sleep in a few hours anyway, and leading up to that, he certainly wasn't trying to pick a fight with a champion elite in the dark. 100,000 Dekarmos in loot just today. Easy money. This might be the most profitable contract I've ever seen. And to think, I only took it to give Jensen a job he could handle. The compass drew Torwin ever eastward, but he was in no hurry to chase it down to its source. No doubt, the monster would be dead long before he ever got close. The phantasmal spear in his hands lacked the reassuring weight Velik was used to. It was easy to compensate for, but it also served as a stark reminder of just how fragile his makeshift weapon actually was. The only saving grace about the whole thing was that his counterpart was nowhere near full strength. Why it wasn't dead was a mystery. Velik was sure he'd scramble the monster's brains, but somehow it was still upright. Neither were anxious to attack, not after so many injuries. The healing potion was doing its work, but at a much slower pace than the system-provided ones. Maybe they weren't as overpriced as he'd grown to believe, instead simply being far too powerful for the use he'd been putting them to. While the potion slowly knitted him back together, he was happy to wait for the wolf to make the first move. It might eventually recover itself, but he doubted it would heal as fast as he was. Time was on his side. He'd be in better shape, and there was a chance of Torwin showing up to help soon. Much as it rankled him to admit it, Apex Hunter had been right when it warned him that this monster that wore his name was stronger than him. He was probably smarter, but that wasn't bridging the gulf in their abilities. Worse, he suspected there were at least 2 more skills he hadn't seen it use yet. Hopefully, they were both passives that contributed to the monster's overall combat capabilities and not attacks it hadn't felt the need to use yet. The wolf made the first move. It still swayed on its feet, but it started a seemingly drunken stumble that quickly morphed into a clumsy run. Getting struck by one of those flailing legs would probably break bones, so Velik quickly leaped out of the way. The trees couldn't really stop the wolf, but they slowed it down enough that it had a hard time bringing its size and weight fully to bear. When it did manage to close the distance, Velik slashed at its face with his spear. It struck the snout and immediately shattered, not slowing the wolf in the slightest. Mentally cursing, he called on phalanx to create 4 more spears and flung them at the wolf's eyes. There weren't any good weak spots, not unless he wanted to try repeating the maneuver that had gotten him lodged in the monster's mouth. Without his real spear to help, he didn't see that working out so well, not that he was willing to risk it anyway. How do I kill you? He thought as he formed a new spear. He kept ahead of the wolf, mostly because it had suffered a traumatic brain injury that should have already killed it. The fact that it was on its feet at all felt like a cruel joke. That it could not only move, but kept fighting, made Velik wonder if some god had a personal grudge with him. Whatever the cause, he couldn't deny that the monster was still a massive threat. Phalanx was his only means of offense, but the problem was that it wasn't really meant for that. The spears were supposed to ward off blows from multiple sources, not penetrate heavily armored monsters. He'd been using it wrong since the day he'd gotten it in the hopes that he could force it to merge with his actual combat skills, and that wasn't working. Without the earring boosting his mystic stat by 15 points, he wouldn't be able to so much as scratch this monster. Slipping through some thick branches to put another tree between him and the wolf, Velik materialized another spear. Kinetic charge was the only way it was getting through anything, and even then, only if he shaped it into what was essentially a 6-foot-long needle. Poking tiny holes was the best he could do. The spears didn't even have the decency to survive the pinprick. Short of merging a skill in the middle of combat, again, his best chance at surviving was to reclaim his broken spear. Half a weapon was better than what he was currently using. The problem was that, while he was keeping ahead of the champion, he wasn't really putting enough distance between them to circle back around. He was also vaguely aware in the back of his mind that he was well outside the boundary of the wolf's domain, but it continued to pursue him anyway. There was no escaping then. Offense was out as long as the best he could do was throw phalanx, spears up between them. Kinetic charge was quickly wearing him down, and all Apex Hunter had to say about the fight was that he'd been an idiot not to run the second he'd spotted the wolf. If I can't get away from it and I can't get around it, there's only one thing left to try. The healing potion had been working on him for a few minutes now, and he was as close to full strength as he was going to get. It was time to be bold. He dodged around a tree, pivoted hard on his lead foot to circle the trunk, and darted past the wolf, coming so close that he actually wove between its legs as it reacted to his sudden change in direction. As he'd hoped, the tree being there prevented it from spinning around and snatching him up in its jaws. He'd even accounted for the possibility of it kicking at him with its rear legs and managed to dodge that. He was 10 feet past its back end and silently congratulating himself for his daring risk when a wolf's tail slammed into him. Velik saw it coming just in time to throw himself sideways and soften the blow. It still blew him off his feet to sail 50 feet through the air. He narrowly missed clipping a tree on the way, not through any skill or foresight on his part, but to blind luck, then struck the ground and bounced twice. He rolled to his feet, shook his head once to try to get some of the blurriness out of his vision, and scrambled forward as best he could without running into something. At best, he had seconds before the monster caught up with him, and he couldn't afford to waste a single one. Unsure if he was even going the right way, Velik took off running at full speed. The sun had fully set by this time, but even with the blow he'd just taken making it hard to focus, the darkness hid no secrets from his eyes. The sound of crashing trees behind him let him know that the wolf was coming after him and how far back it was. Not as far as he would have liked, but maybe far enough. There! Without slowing down, Velik threw his body into a no-handed cartwheel and snatched up the top half of his spear. The shaft was only 2 feet long, its end a bundle of splinters with cracks running up through the wood. It probably wouldn't withstand the rigors of combat, which meant he had, at best, one final shot with it. It needed to be a good one. He looped around the next tree and saw the wolf coming for him. Blood seeped out from between its teeth and splattered in great blobs to the carpet of dead leaves and churned earth beneath it, and little rivulets stained its black fur from all the pinprick strikes he'd given it. He'd definitely hurt it, just maybe not enough to give him the opening he needed. One thing he'd learned was that kinetic charge was more versatile than he'd thought when he'd first picked it. His weapon wasn't the only thing he could build up energy behind, though doing it to his body put an uncomfortable amount of strain on him. Discomfort beat death, however, so when he started charging at the wolf, his half-spear gripped in his hand, his every step felt like he was straining against invisible hands trying to hold him back. He watched the muscles in the wolf's chest and legs tense as it shifted its weight to lunge at him, teeth bared. It wouldn't make the mistake of letting him back through those obsidian shards without tearing him apart again, and he knew it. Even if he could somehow trick it and slip between its jaws, he didn't think half a spear was going to cut it. So, when he leaped, he aimed higher. Empowered by kinetic charge, he flew 40 feet into the air. The wolf, slowed from its many injuries, reacted with relative sluggishness. Had Velik tried this at the start of the fight, it would have picked him out of the air, chewed him up, and swallowed him. This time was too slow. Its neck flexed as its head snapped up, trying to keep track of the rapidly approaching, dusk-bound human. Even wounded, it almost got him. A fang slashed across Velik's leg, slicing deep and knocking him into a spin that ruined his aim. One chance. Don't screw this up. His body completed the first revolution, and the wolf's face came back into view. Velik's half-spear was out of position to strike, and without being able to use his second hand to help control it, he struggled to fix that problem. Without thinking, he activated Phalanx and created a phantasmal shaft that reached up and twined itself around the broken remnant of his old spear. On the second revolution, he was ready. He thrust the spear forward with both hands and released every bit of kinetic charge he was still holding on to. The spear sank into the monster's eye, all the way past where it transitioned into conjure material, halting about 5 feet back. The thing has to be scraping the back of its skull. It's dead. Please be dead. Velik slammed bodily into the wolf's snout, rebounded into open air, and fell 30 feet to the ground, where he lay still and stared at the dark shadow looming over him. Come on, die. You're dead. Where's the system message? The wolf's face peered down at him, one of its crimson eyes ruined and weeping black blood. It took a hesitant step forward. Then, without warning, it toppled sideways. You have slain Velik the Black Fang, champion elite, level 44. You have taken a champion seed from its former owner, Chalin. Champion seed's current reserves, 0/270. Fetching the remains of his spear out of the monster's ruined eye was Velik's first task. Unfortunately, the phantasmal shaft he'd constructed out of Phalanx had shattered into motes of light, leaving the tangible, physical portion buried out of sight. That was why, after drinking another healing potion, he was standing on the dead wolf's face with one arm buried up to the shoulder in gore, while he blindly groped for the weapon. Fang Morgus, this shirt has mending on it. It would never come clean without that. His hand brushed against something hard and slender enough to wrap his fingers around. With a sickening squelch, he pulled on it and slowly retracted the spear. Its shaft was even more battered, probably 6 inches shorter from all the chunks of wood that had broken loose. The head was still in good shape, albeit dyed black with monster blood. This, on the other hand, might never recover, even with mending. Velik didn't have the Dekarmos to replace the spear, and he was days away from anything remotely resembling safety. Phalanx was his only defense, and while he was confident that he could kill monsters around his level with the skill, taking on elites was another story entirely. It would be faster to slink back home, run all the way down to the city, fence the champion seeds he already had, buy a new spear, and run all the way back out here than it would be to try to kill enough monsters to earn the Dekarmos himself. He hoped it wouldn't come down to that. Velik hopped down, gave the wolf one last, searching look, and strode away to find the other half of his spear. He lined them up together, lined a straight stick up at the break, and used a ragged strip of cloth to tie them all together. Given how fast mending normally worked, he figured he'd know if it was working in an hour or two. It'd probably take a full day to actually repair the damage, but he'd feel a lot better just knowing that the magic could fix things. In the meantime, he rested his back against a tree and looked at the champion seed he'd taken from the wolf. The words of the system message raised more questions, but gave nothing in the way of answers. Champion seed. Used to grow a champion elite monster to guard a specified location. Requires mana to flourish. Champion, Velik the Black Fang, level 44. Current owner, Velik. Current reserve, 0/270. What does it mean? Does Chalin create the champions and name them? Did he name this one after me? And why does it have my class as part of its name? That can't be a coincidence. It definitely used 2 of my class skills in our fight. Morgus's hairy balls, that's a big wolf, a voice said from 50 feet away. Seriously? Where were you 10 minutes ago? Velik mentally demanded. He glanced up and saw Torwin standing there, his bow held next to him and his other hand on his hip. Frowning, he peered at the corpse and said, Level 44? How the hell did you ever kill that? Obstinance and luck? Mostly, Velik said. He pulled himself back to his feet. I was kind of hoping you'd show up and help. I would have if I'd known you were fighting something like this. I figured I was pretty close when the compass shifted directions, and I wanted to see what it was that had it wiggling around like a rent girl passing by a freshly docked ship. Followed your tracks the rest of the way in. What tracks? Velik asked blandly. He knew he didn't leave anything as mundane as footprints behind when he walked, not with Apex Hunter in his skill roster. Torwin just winked before turning his attention back to the wolf. Shame we don't have the time or storage capacity to properly harvest this. Level 44 has got to have some good stuff in it. I've never bothered. No, a lot of money to leave behind, but then I suppose you'd have no one to sell any materials to or process them on your behalf. Never mind transporting them. Still, something this high a level ought to be worth taking a few things. Torwin circled around the corpse, stopping at the teeth. Those re-interesting. And, that's a big hole in the tongue. Velik felt Torwin's eyes on him, and was suddenly acutely aware that his clothes were soaked in not only blood, but saliva. I told you obstinacy and luck. So, it would seem, Torwin chuckled. But don't sell yourself short. A kill like this takes a great deal of skill and raw power. Do I tell him about the name? Would that make him suspicious of me? If he decided to share, there was no taking it back. For the moment, it was easier to put off making a decision. Torwin had been helpful, but Velik knew better than to trust someone just because they'd had a few kind words and done him a favor or two. He'd learned that lesson a year after the incident when some local boys had started showing up in the woods near the edge of town. Velik had been starved for human contact. They'd been friendly, and he'd thought he was making progress towards getting the town to accept him again. A week went by. He'd shown up at the usual meeting spot, and 2 men armed with clubs had been waiting for him. He'd only barely gotten away with his life, and he'd learned to stay far, far away from D-Sure that day. The worst part of it was that, to this day, he still didn't know if those kids had betrayed him or if their families had merely found out they'd been talking to him and decided to correct that behavior. Either way, those 2 men had almost killed him, and Velik had learned a valuable lesson about being vulnerable. What are you doing? Velik asked. There's some mana pooled in the teeth. They're good base material for some daggers, maybe a spearhead or a short sword, Torwin explained. He was brandishing a curved knife in one hand while holding the wolf's lip back with the other. We need a full team to harvest something this big, but I can pick up a few of the more valuable and easy to collect pieces, just so the whole thing's not wasted. How do you know what parts are valuable? Just something you pick up over time? Partially, but it's also a safe assumption that if the monster has mana in some part of its body, that someone, somewhere, can find a use for it. So when you have an unfamiliar, or, in this case, unique monster, you can't go wrong targeting the highest concentrations of mana if you need to be picky about what to take. For this monster, that means the teeth. He couldn't help but feel a flash of annoyance when he considered how much wealth he'd abandoned over the years. Thousands and thousands of monsters have been left where they'd fallen, food for scavengers. There was no telling how useful some of those monster parts would have been if he'd known what to take and who could use it. It didn't really matter, he supposed. He had nobody to trade it to. Something must have shown on his face, because Torwin laughed and said, Most normal monsters aren't worth much. It's the elites that have the good stuff, and even then, not all of them. Here, come help me, and I'll show you how to pop these out without damaging them. Somewhat mollified, Velik left his bound-together spear on the ground and walked over to the corpse. At Torwin's direction, He held the lip up so the older hunter could use both hands. After watching the knife work required to cut the tooth loose, Velik took a turn at it himself. Not as easy as you made it look, he observed after he'd butchered the process. That's all right. Nobody gets everything right on the first try. Here, do it again on this one. The smaller ones don't have such deep roots. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He'd gone to sleep months ago, all too aware that his body needed the rest while his mind was elsewhere. There's always something more to do. New monsters to be made, new people to be corrupted, new territory to be claimed. As long as everything went as planned, it was entirely possible to hibernate through all of the busy work. Things were not going according to plan. Something was cutting the threads, unraveling the nodes he'd placed to channel his mana through. Territory was shrinking. That needed to be corrected, but he couldn't do that while he slept. His mind had to be called back, had to take control again. He hated returning to his body. His own flesh repulsed him, the one thing he couldn't shape. No matter how hard he tried, he was trapped in a form he despised. Escaping that prison was all that mattered, and something was preventing him from reaching that goal. Eyes opened, first one, then two, then 20. His many arms ceased their autonomous work and heeded his command, becoming still for the first time since his hibernation had started. The animals his body had been working on gasped out desperate, dying breaths, slowly succumbing to the grievous wounds he'd shaped into their flesh. Without his magic actively working to sustain them through the transformations, they couldn't escape their ultimate fate, not that he cared. He was too distracted to pay attention, too intent on following the severed thread of his favorite creation. Someone had destroyed it, and he needed to know who. The mending enchantment on the spear wasn't fixing the damage, or if it was doing it far too slowly. Torwin was done cutting everything he wanted to claim off the corpse, and Velik had played along as a way to pass the time. Without the mana sensing skill to help him pick out the important bits, he wouldn't be able to do much harvesting on his own, but a brief search of the system store had revealed a few pieces of gear that could offset his lack of the requisite skill, so the knowledge might be helpful in the future. But it had been 3 hours, and checking on his weapon had revealed no change. Bad luck, Torwin said when Velik excused himself to go see the progress. That'll be expensive to fix. It also means a long, dangerous trip back to a safer stretch of the woods. I'll struggle to kill anything even close to my level without a weapon. It's a system store weapon, isn't it? Torwin asked. Just feed it the seed you got from his champion? Or any of them, I guess, but the higher the level, the better. Velik pulled the champion seed out of his bag and studied it. Like all the others, it looked like a literal seed, oblong, hard-shelled, jet black except for a single slash of crimson red going through it. The color was the only difference from every other one he'd collected. How does this help? It belatedly occurred to him that Torwin had some sort of analyzing skill, and Velik didn't know if it worked on objects as well as people. He didn't need this particular champion's name revealed to the other hunter, and pulling the seed out might have given Torwin a chance to get a good look at it. Torwin didn't seem to notice. It's part of why they're so valuable. I thought I explained this already when I took those first two to sell. Enchanters can use them to increase the power of your equipment. Right, I remember that, but how does that help? I'm not an enchanter. If it's a system piece, it doesn't matter. The system just needs the raw material, and it does the work for you. It's probably one of the biggest advantages to getting your gear directly from the system instead of having someone make it, though it's debatable if it's worth the price tag. Then, using this seed on my spear could repair it? Velik asked, and strengthen it at the same time. How do I use it? The process wasn't all that complicated, or at least Torwin made it seem easy when he explained it. There were some system menus involved, but with the older hunter explaining how to navigate to the spot Velik needed, he was quickly able to use up the champion seed to upgrade his spear. Bloodseeker has been infused with the essence of the champion, Velik the Black Fang. Bloodseeker has been upgraded from epic to legendary quality. Bloodseeker has become harbinger of dusk. Before his eyes, the weapon transformed. Where before the shaft had looked like smooth, dark wood, now it was matte black metal. The two pieces had twined together, fusing back into one flawless length of... What is this even made of? It's not steel. Too light. Whatever it was solid and strong to Velik's cursory inspection. More importantly, the weapon had gained more stats, bringing his bonus from 5 physical up to 15 physical and 5 mystic, and it had gained a new enchantment on top of its old ones. Now, it had shape-shifting, bleeding, sharp, mending from before, and mana drinker as well. The name made it obvious enough what it did. It took mana from anything he could stab it into. What the spear did with that mana wasn't specified, however. Easy enough to find out, I hope. "What's mana drinker do with the mana it takes?" he asked. Torwin sucked in a sharp breath. "You got mana drinker? Is that rare?" "A bit more than that. Must have been a hell of a champion seed you fed to that thing." It had been both the highest level monster Velik had ever personally seen and a champion elite, so he supposed that qualified. It didn't answer his question, however. "So what does it do?" "It's generally used with other enchantments, especially ones that can be fueled by the user. A lot of wands, for example, work by having a spell bonded to them. The wielder feeds mana into the wand, the spell activates. Mana Drinker isn't part of that setup because it's rare and expensive, and because it would require you to find some monster with mana to steal, then poke them physically with the wand to get it. But poking things with a spear is what it's all about, so I'm good there." "Right. But if your spear doesn't have an enchantment on it that actually requires an outside source of mana to fuel it, then Mana Drinker is a lot less useful. It'll still help, don't get me wrong. Mending will be able to eat up that excess mana to restore your spear to pristine condition much, much faster. Everything it does now, it'll do better, assuming you're fighting monsters with mana for you to steal." It sounded situationally useful at best, but maybe Velik was just underestimating it. The important part, to him, was that the infusion of power from the champion seed has repaired the damage, and the upgraded stats didn't hurt either. With another 5 or 6 hours until dawn, he might be able to find and kill the next champion. There can't be that many more of these things left. Between the two of us, we've killed close to a dozen. Don't underestimate how powerful Mana Drinker is. Even if you don't have a good enchantment to funnel the mana into, just stealing from a target is a huge handicap for them. This giant wolf, for example, is so big that I can almost guarantee it needed magic just to keep it moving around. If you'd been able to attack its mana, you could have slowed it down, probably stopped it from using some abilities like whatever it did to that one tree over there with the burns all over it. It would have been a much easier fight. "That's good," Velik said. "I hope I don't encounter anything this strong again, but you never know. There's at least one more champion out there. Or this might be the last one. Maybe all that's left is whatever's behind them," Torwin argued. "That would be nice. Even if we killed it tonight, there's still weeks or even months of cleanup left to do in this region." "You're sticking around for that?" Velik asked, surprised. He'd expected the professional monster hunters to clear out once they'd destroyed the source of the infestation. Job's not done until all the monsters are gone. "I don't think you'll ever leave if you want to kill all of them. I've been trying to do that for years. There were times when I go weeks without seeing another one, but they always come back. The big ones need to be killed, at least. Anything over level 20 is too much of a threat, and all the elites need to be killed. I have a suspicion this is going to be a long job, and probably one that's going to require more than just me and my apprentice to finish." Velik could scarcely imagine a world in which no monsters roamed the forests of the frontier. What would I even do with my life? Go somewhere else, I guess. And then do what? Well, I've got another hour or two before I call it night, and I suppose you've got until the sun comes back up. Shall we see what's next in the chain?" Torwin asked. "I suppose that would be a good idea," Velik replied, brandishing his newly improved spear. He couldn't wait to see how it did in battle. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. This druid girl, Sildra, was all right in a fight, but not reliable. At first, Jensen had tried to treat her like an ally, but he'd quickly realized that was putting too much trust in her capabilities. It was obvious that she'd had no training. She got distracted easily, couldn't focus on multiple monsters at a time, and couldn't handle watching his flank for him. It was easier to use solo tactics, even if they weren't necessarily the most efficient way to go about the hunt, than it was to try to explain to her what he needed her to do. It wasn't that she was stupid. She just didn't have the training to pull her weight. So instead, he mostly just pretended she wasn't there, and if she incidentally killed a few monsters, well, that made his job a bit easier. That was the theory, at least. In truth, she'd gotten in trouble a few times, fights that maybe she could have managed to extricate herself from, but maybe not. Either way, he'd given her some support, she'd thanked him afterwards, and they continued on in the same manner. "Excuse me, sir," one of the loggers he'd been protecting from monstrous aggression said. "Not really my place to ask, but what level are you? You wiped those monsters out like it was nothing." Level. Jensen considered the question. It was kind of rude, maybe not as bad as using something like identify on a person, but still, screw it. He's not trying to be rude. He just doesn't know any better. 19. Wow, really? I'm level 17, and I couldn't come close to doing what you did. Well, I'm sure you chopped down a tree in half the time it'd take me, Jensen told him. He glanced back at the closest monster corpse, riddled with arrow wounds, though most of the arrows had already faded into nothingness, and saw that Sildra had already walked away. She was nowhere in sight, but her tracks were plainly visible. "Sorry, I need to go catch up to my, partner." Without waiting for the logger to reply, he hurried off. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Level 19? Those two can't be the only ones. Who else is out here with you? Sildra had known she'd miss Gorm when he left, but she hadn't known how much. He'd been something of a friend to her, even if he was only there because of her mother's money. He'd gone beyond the stipulations of his contract to help her complete her system quest, and even stuck around past its expiration while she found her feet with her new class. The hired monster hunter was probably more skilled than Gorm, but he was much less personable. He made plans, didn't bother to tell her what her role in them was supposed to be, and then got annoyed when she didn't do her part. His attempts to explain what he'd wanted her to do and why after the fact had fairly dripped with condescension. Sadly, he was the only one going out of his way to look for monsters to fight, and while her progress was incredible, she was only level 9. Lunar Flare was an excellent skill, and she'd killed monsters that were a higher level a few times, but there was a difference between frying a level 12 and fighting off a level 20. For the time being, she needed Jensen's help, and that meant putting up with his less-than-amazing personality. Hopefully, getting a new skill at level 10 would start to change that. That would have to wait for tomorrow night, however. The sun would be up in an hour or so, and Lunar Flare worked best under a full moon. Having her only skill be dependent on both the time of day and phase of the moon was a bit of a pain, but she was hoping that she could rank it up a few times and loosen those restrictions. For the next few days, at least, she was as powerful as she could be under the circumstances. "I'm going back to D. Sure," she told Jensen. "See you at the same place tomorrow night?" Assuming I could drag myself out of bed. "I'm exhausted from you keeping me up all night," he said with a snort. That was another thing she didn't like about him. His jokes weren't funny, but he thought they were. At first, she'd interpreted it as him making a pass at her, but she'd quickly realized that no, that was just how he was, a little awkward, weirdly full of himself, and rich enough to get away with it. She wondered if he had even a single real friend back home, or if he was surrounded by nothing but sycophants hoping to get a turn rifling through his coin purse. "I'm sure you'll manage," she said dryly. "Goodbye, Jensen." Something in her tone must have gotten through his thick skull, because his face twisted into a stricken grimace. "Sorry," he muttered, so quietly that she wasn't even sure he was talking to her. "Didn't think about how that sounded until after I'd already said it. Be careful on your way back. Don't want you getting killed by a monster because you're too exhausted to defend yourself," was all she said as she walked away. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Why is the gate open? None of the frontier towns kept their gates open at night. That was like inviting the monsters in, and they needed no invitation. The problem was keeping them out, even with the gates closed. Some of them could fly, or climb, or were just stealthy enough to get in some other way. If the gate needed to be open for some reason, there were always members of the watch there to supervise it. She scanned the walls, but there was no one. That didn't prove anything, of course. Her night vision was decent, but not exceptional. It was possible she just wasn't seeing anyone in the dark, but she doubted it. She'd always seen them every other time she came back to town. There were even a few who'd make small talk with her while she stood at the base of the wall waiting for the sun to rise and the gates to open. Was there some kind of invasion? There's no damage, though. Maybe they just opened them early for the day. Something about that idea didn't sit right with her, and Sildra found herself hurrying across the open fields to investigate. She cast furtive glances about as she approached while trying to conquer her paranoia that a monster was going to jump out from a patch of bean plants and assault her, not because she didn't fully believe it was possible, but because if one tried, she'd turn it to ash before it got close. 100 feet away from the open gate, she finally saw movement. A man walked into the entrance and peered out. He was tall, taller than her, anyway, and had a distinctive silhouette thanks to the peg legs strapped on where his left foot was supposed to be and a cane he leaned on to help keep his balance. He'd been a logger who'd lost a limb in a monster attack 6 years ago who'd retired from leaving the village and had taken up carpentry instead. "What's he doing here?" "There you are," he said. "Get inside. Hurry." The sound of his voice confirmed what she'd already known. The man was Vickers, someone who had no business filling in for anyone on the watch. If he was manning the mysteriously open gate, something bad had happened while she was away. "What's going on?" she asked once she'd reached him. "Where's the watch at?" "Follow me," he said shortly. "The call's gone out." "What call?" Ignoring her baffled expression, Vickers stomped away. "Move it, Missy. I've been stuck out here for hours, waiting for you to get back." Sildra stopped walking. "No, I'm not going anywhere with you until you tell me what happened. Why is this gate open? Where did the watch go? Why are you here instead of them?" Vickers spun back around, his gnarled face twisted up in an angry scowl. "Knew you'd be trouble," he said. "Ain't my job to explain nothing to you, just to fetch you. Don't think I won't tan your hide, just because you grew up some." "Try it, old man," she snapped. "See how well it goes for you." Before either of them could do anything, something small, dark, and furry leaped out of the shadow of the wall. It angled itself to race past Vickers and leaped at Sildra's face, passing through the moonlight just long enough for her to identify it as the biggest flash maw hare she'd ever seen. Without even thinking, she hit it with a blast of lunar flare, throwing it off course and sending it smacking hard into a house 15 feet behind her. "What in the—" she started to say, only to cut herself off as Vickers raised his cane in one hand and lunged forward. For a moment, she thought he was going after the hare. He was far too late to do anything, but there was no other reasonable explanation. It wasn't until the cane came down on her shoulder that she realized the truth. He attacked me. The only reason he'd hit her shoulder instead of her head was that she'd jerked back a step from him. Vickers overbalanced, not a difficult feat with all his forward momentum on his peg leg and his cane being wielded like a club, and fell flat on his face. Without hesitation, he scrabbled across the ground to clutch at her ankle. "What the hell are you doing?" she yelled as she shook him off. The flashmaw hare wasn't dead. Smoke rolled off its scorched fur, wafting away to reveal patches of reddened skin beneath, but that wasn't enough to stop it. It took 2 hopping steps before launching itself through the air at her again. Only this time she was too busy fending off Vickers to dodge out of the way in time. The hare hit her with its full weight, knocking her over and leaving her open to its needle-like teeth. Blood poured from her stomach where the bone spurs sticking out of its hind leg gouged her, and its mouth clamped down on her already injured shoulder, drawing a scream out of her. Lunar flare bloomed around her, searing the monster and blistering her skin from the wash of heat. It was that, or let herself be eaten, and she'd recover from burns. A second, lunar flare, followed that one, and with 3 solid shots laid down on the flashmaw hare, it finally succumbed. "You have slain a flashmaw hare, level 14. You have been awarded 1 to karma. You have advanced to level 10, plus 1 mental, plus 1 free point. You have unlocked a new class skill slot." She would have been more excited about that if she wasn't still grappling with Vickers. Now that he had her on the ground, his peg leg wasn't hobbling him quite so much. He quickly climbed on top of her, one hand holding both of hers over her head and his other with a raised cane in it. "Should have heeded the call, stupid girl," he snarled. Sildra had no idea what was wrong with the old man, but she wasn't about to let herself get beaten to death. Whatever the fallout was, she'd deal with it later. "Should have waited another half an hour to jump me," she said back. Lunar flare bloomed around Vickers, igniting his clothes in pale, moon-colored flames. The heat came and went in an instant, but that was long enough. Vickers hurled himself away from Sildra, screeching the whole while, and rolled back and forth across the ground as the skill burned him alive. She scrambled to her feet and scooped up his cane, though she wasn't sure whether it was to protect herself with it or just to deny him the weapon. You have slain a corrupted seed-bearer, level 18. What the hell is a corrupted seed-bearer? What the hell is a corrupted seed-bearer? Velik asked. Torwin frowned, but didn't answer. They stood over the corpses of 3 strange monsters, all of which Velik would have said he recognized. One was an enormous mist toad, probably the biggest Velik had ever seen at close to 8 feet tall. The other 2 were a hookpaw bear and a burrow skidder. At least, that's what they should have been, but the system had other ideas. They didn't identify as that until we killed them, Torwin finally said. That means they got some sort of skill to hide what they really are, which is probably some sort of parasitic monster. Maybe they killed the hosts and took over the meat. If so, they had access to the host skills. The mist toad was leaving clouds of vapor everywhere. Torwin nodded along. It's also possible that the hosts were still alive and that the parasites took them over, but I don't think so. We would have gotten notifications for killing the host monsters in that case. These things must somehow copy their host abilities, maybe more. More? Velik asked. Memories, Torwin clarified. Monsters that can copy skills usually can copy more than that. Sometimes they're infiltrators. You're saying these could get into humans and walk around town? It's possible. I've never seen anything like this, and I've been here killing monsters since the beginning. Are these new, or have they already made it back to the frontier? More importantly, now that we know they're out there, is there a way to find them that doesn't involve killing the host? What can we do about this? He asked. Well, what would you do if you were by yourself? Put it out of my mind and keep going. I don't have a way to hunt these things down, so there's nothing I can do but keep trying to eliminate the source. I wouldn't even know what they are if not for you. That's about all we can do. We need some sort of specialist investigator to root these things out, someone with some sort of monster detection skill, and there aren't too many types of classes that can do that. Unless, can you? Velik shook his head. I had intuition at one point that might have pointed me at a monster in disguise, but I folded it into other skills a while ago. Now it just kind of gives me a vague assessment of relative strength between myself and a monster I'm fighting and helps me spot potential ambushes. Hunter types are the most likely to have the requisite skills, but even most classes don't get them, Torwin explained. I was hoping since yours was unique. I don't have a free skill slot even if I can find something in my class list, Velik said. If only I could get Phalanx to merge into Spear Warden, I could change that. Probably for the best. No point in ruining your build, taking a niche skill that's situationally useful right now, but which you'll probably never need again once this job is done. For now, I think you've got the right of it. Best thing we can do is keep moving forward until we find the root cause of all these problems. Once again, Velik lamented the lack of a distance reader on the mana compass. For all he knew, they could be minutes away from the next target. Or maybe it was hours. He'd messed with the parameters he'd set up a few times, trying to find information and narrow things down, but in the end, the best and easiest way to find large sources of mana was when it manifested as a champion elite. Not that that's led us to anything worth finding, but it's only been a few days. And even if we don't find the source this way, it's still good to get rid of these things. If Chalin really is the one making these things, though, this is the only way I can think of to find him. Torwin seemed insistent on keeping up with Velik now, even to the point of staying up throughout the night and matching his sleeping cycle. The old hunter was powerful enough that Velik knew the dark didn't really hinder his vision, but he still preferred to work alone. On the other hand, if he was going to be fighting another champion over level 40, he could use some help. It was really a miracle he'd survived the last fight. They left the 3 corpses behind and followed the compass west and north toward a small mountain range. Neither of them voiced the fear, but Velik figured Torwin was just as concerned as he was that their next target was behind that natural barrier. It would probably be the work of weeks to circumvent it. The sun started to rise well before they reached it, and they quickly settled on a location to catch some sleep and worked out a watch rotation. Velik was accustomed to sleeping lightly, but he wasn't going to turn away some extra security when he was at his most vulnerable, especially with the number of monsters in the upper 30s range of levels in the area. Torwin settled himself in, leaving Velik to do a circuit around the area. It took him about half an hour to kill all the nearby monsters, a feat he accomplished much more easily thanks to his newly upgraded spear. The remaining champion cores he was holding tempted him greatly, but he held firm by reminding himself that selling those would bring him the riches he needed to buy more pieces of gear, and that once this was all over with, he could travel to a city with craftsmen who could make those pieces at a fraction of the price. All he had to do was think of Torwin's apprentice, a guy who was fairly mediocre as far as his talents went with a similarly unimpressive class to pair with it. But his father had more money than the gods, and Jensen was kitted out in all sorts of trinkets that let him hit far above his level. Velik wanted some of those toys for himself. He was up to just over 2,000 dekarmos, and if he had to grind the rest of the money out this way, it'd be the work of years. Every champion he killed represented weeks or months of work. From what Velik understood about how champions normally only appeared in dungeons, and that when they died, they didn't leave seeds behind, it was extremely rare to get even a single one, let alone multiples. There was some way to claim the seeds from a dungeon once its core was destroyed, but that only resulted in one or two, depending on the dungeon's size. A harvest of a dozen or more champion seeds was unheard of. At least, that was what Torwin had told him when he'd asked why they were so valuable. With his lap around the new camp complete, Velik returned and settled down to do his few hours of watch through the dawn. His spear rested against his shoulder, waiting for the next monster to make the mistake of getting too close to would-be prey. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Sildra's chest heaved from the exertion of running. No less than 7 people had descended on her seconds after she'd killed Vickers, 3 of them part of the town watch. She'd tried to stammer out an explanation, but they hadn't bothered to talk. As one, they'd advanced on her with pitiless, blank expressions on their face and logging axes or defenders' spears held in their hands. She'd done the only thing she could. She'd run for her life. Lunar Flare took something out of her each time she used it, and she was already tired from a night's hunting. Fighting off the flash maw hair and whatever the hell that thing pretending to be Vickers had taken the rest of her energy. When she'd been immediately confronted with another battle, there'd only been one option. Unfortunately, her pursuers weren't content to let her go. They'd started a game of cat and mouse in the woods, except there were 7 cats working cooperatively against her, and she wasn't sure if she could fight back without hurting them. Without any understanding of what had happened to Vickers, she had no clue if she'd killed the man she'd known her whole life or just some monster pretending to be him. She was half a mile into the forest, hiding in a tree that loomed over a thicket and hoping no one would spot her. The town watch would be the highest level, and thus the most likely to sniff out her hiding place, but she needed a few minutes to recover before she started running again. If nothing else, she wanted her reserves of magic fortified enough to handle 3 or 4 casts of Lunar Flare. It wasn't that she was planning on killing anyone else, but if it came down to them or her, she knew what her choice would be. Morgus, tell me what's going on here. Please, I don't know what happened. How do I save these people? You have been granted a new quest. Purge the town of Deshur of the corrupted seed bearers. With the quest came the knowledge of what her patron deity wanted of her. The system said it in words, but Morgus imparted his directives directly into her mind. Without hesitation, she went into her system menus and found her class skills. It was easy to locate the one she needed. You have gained the skill, Eye of the Moon. Its description was simple enough. The light of the moon revealed monsters, even if she couldn't see them. Instantly, the location of dozens of monsters in the forest appeared in her mind, including 7 human-shaped ones all nearby. Monsters they are, then. Thank you for marking my path for me. I know what to do from here. The first thing to do was kill the monsters chasing her. Sildra didn't have it in her to Lunar Flare all of them, but she was still armed with Vickers' cane. The Watch were the most dangerous of her pursuers, so she used her new skill to turn the tables on her would-be stalkers. The first watchman went down quickly and easily. He never even saw Sildra lurking behind a bush just off the trail. The pale light of the skill engulfed him, eliciting a brief scream of pain before he was consumed. You have slain a corrupted seed bearer, level 16. She could only hope that these monsters were copies of people and not the people themselves. Morgus willing, she'd find a Real townsfolk tied up somewhere alive. Either way, she needed to do this in the next hour before lunar flare lost all its impact. Not being able to utilize it during the day was a huge drawback, but the extra power it received at night was the only reason she could reliably kill monsters above her own level. One of the guys on the local logging crew came charging at her, axe raised over his head to split her skull open. He didn't make it within 10 feet before he succumbed to a burst of pale white light and collapsed into the dirt. You have slain a corrupted seed bearer, level 13. She snuck up on another logger, this one barely 14. If not for the certainty that Eye of the Moon granted her, she would have struggled to attack him. But the skill told her the boy in front of her was a monster, and she believed it. Her stolen cane came down on his head, causing him to drop bonelessly to the ground. To an outside observer, it would have looked like she gave a merciless, fatal beating to a teenager. The whole time she was doing it, she kept an eye out for the other 4 monsters nearby, and never had she been happier to see a notification confirming the boy was another seed bearer once she struck the final blow. You have slain a corrupted seed bearer, level 7. I need to take this axe if I'm going to be killing them like this, she thought to herself. Using a cane is way too much work. Sildra was by no means weak, but she'd invested all of her free points in a mystic, and every logger and watchman knew the value of a high physical stat. She was left with only her natural gains from a rugged frontier life, which put her at a solid 9 physical. That was good enough to chop wood, but maybe not so great against a logger whose physical would be 20 or higher. This was likely the only opportunity she was going to get, as lunar flare didn't spare its victims' weapons. She killed off both of the other watchmen in quick succession, but in doing so, ran herself completely dry and was left to face the last 2 loggers. They worked together, and despite her efforts to isolate them, caught sight of her at the same time. Sildra retreated behind a tree, readied the axe, and waited. Thanks to Eye of the Moon, she knew exactly where both monsters were, which meant she could time her swing perfectly. The first logger came barreling around the curve in the trail, just in time to take an axe to the chest. He grunted in pain and toppled sideways, jerking the weapon out of her hand and taking it with him as he collapsed. There was no kill notification, and worse, now she was unarmed and facing the second logger. He let out a wordless bellow, raised his axe up, and jerked in place. With a groan, he staggered forward, the axe going slack in his grip. It wasn't until he started to turn that Sildra saw the arrow sticking out of his back, and even as she noticed it, a second joined it. You can't stop this, he coughed out as he dropped. Okay, Jensen said as he strode forward, bow in hand. I'm going to assume things have gone crazy here as well. Jensen, what are you doing here? Wait, what do you mean crazy here as well? What happened? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At least 30, Sildra reported. Most of them are in the middle of town. At least, Jensen echoed. You're not sure. The skill only lets me know about monsters that are illuminated by the moon. If they're indoors or underground, I don't think it'll work. And whatever is going on, it's affecting at least 2 towns. Damn it, we don't have time to deal with this tonight. Okay, I figure it best we got an hour before you lose the ability to tell the monsters from the humans, and even that's stretching it. The sun's going to be up in a few minutes. That might degrade the skill's effectiveness faster than I'm anticipating. Then we'd better hurry. They were standing at the edge of the fields, a quarter-mile or less from the still-open gate. The town was dark behind it, all silhouettes against the pre-dawn light that was rapidly erasing any advantage the duo had against the strange monster invasion. Together, they rushed forward, Sildra relying on Eye of the Moon to make sure nothing snuck up on them, and Jensen using whatever it was he always used. He hadn't been forthcoming about his skills, and she hadn't pried. The first monster they spotted wasn't a corrupted seed bearer disguised as a person, but a big rat-looking thing that came up to Sildra's hip and had a tail as long as she was tall. It hissed at them, but Jensen silenced the monster with a flurry of arrows to the face. Can you tell which monster is which? He asked. No. Damn. Better hope we get lucky then. Let's hurry. They found the first seed bearer shortly after that, and Jensen put the woman down with ruthless efficiency the moment Sildra confirmed she was a monster. That was the server at the tavern, Sildra muttered. Why would anyone want to control her? Figure it out later, Jensen urged. Watching him scythe through every monster they found was somewhat daunting. Worse, it came with the realization that he'd been holding back immensely during their joint outings, letting her take the lead and get the kills she needed to raise her level. She thought she had his measure, but this Jensen was nothing like the man she'd worked with. He didn't make jokes now. He didn't meander or do that thing where he got all cocky and lazily raised his bow up before letting off a half-hearted shot. Every arrow formed with speed and instantly leapt off the bowstring. Every shot found its target, and most enemies couldn't survive more than one or two. They were walking past the butcher shop when a motion in the shadow of the open door caught her eye. Loon the butcher was running at her, a cleaver raised in his hand and a feral snarl on his lips. Jensen was already 20 feet ahead down the road, heading toward the large knot of monsters in the middle of town, leaving her to deal with the ambush on her own. Lunar flare sparked over the man, but it was weak now. Pale flickers of flame washed across his arms and chest, eliciting a few curls of smoke and nothing else. Loon was 50 years old, his face covered with gray stubble and his hair thin and wispy on the sides of his head. He'd always been kind to Sildra's family when she'd been a child. More than once, he'd given them the hide from a butchered animal for her mother to work on. The apron he wore was her work. So was the sheath a carving knife was resting in on her hip. Sildra still remembered one day, when she was 6, he'd given her a sweet he'd picked up from a caravan that had come through the week earlier. Loon didn't seem to care about their shared history. He bounded down the 2 steps leading from his butcher shop to the street and swung the cleaver viciously. The instant he set foot beyond his shop, Eye of the Moon confirmed the horrible truth she'd already guessed. Not him, too. What about Mom? Did this corruption take everyone I care about? Lunar flare hadn't slowed him down, but she still had a logger's axe in hand. With a tear in her eye, she swung it into Loon's hip. He roared in pain, drawing Jensen's attention. But for once, Sildra was the faster of the two. She jerked the axe back out and swung again, this time taking half his hand and sending the cleaver flying along with the fingers. Loon jerked in place as feathered arrow shafts bloomed between his ribs. He took a single, faltering step forward, then dropped to his knees. Sildra, he hissed, you can't stop us all, not now. You should join us instead. You have helped slay a corrupted seed-bearer, level 23. You have been awarded 1 to karma. Are you all right? Jensen asked. He jogged back down the street and scanned the inside of the butcher shop, but there was no one else there. Loon had been a lifelong bachelor. However, the corruption had made its way inside his shop. He'd been its only victim. He was like family, she said simply. I've known him my whole life. Him and my mother worked closely. I'm going to find the bastard who did this, and I'm going to burn him to ashes. Better do it quickly. The sun's fully up now. Town Hall was the biggest building in D-Shur by far. The mayor lived there, and all governance business was conducted from inside it. There wasn't any single place that could hold the entire town's population, not normally, but for holding prisoners, it was more than big enough. There were both people and monsters standing guard outside the building. Even with Eye of the Moon ceasing to function, it wasn't hard to guess that any person who was working with the obvious monsters must be one themselves. Unfortunately, with the sun fully risen, Sildra was about as weak as she could be. Jensen was more confident, but not by much. The monsters had already shown that they could work together, not just the corrupted seed-bearers, but the normal monsters from the forest with them. That was unusual and probably meant they'd gathered under an elite, and with the seed-bearers showing at least near-human levels of intelligence, he was wary of the idea of taking on a crowd like that. 4 or 5 is one thing, he grumbled. I could kill half of them before they even get close. But 30 or 40? No. Even if I killed half, the other half would rip us apart. We're going to need to rethink this and come up with a better plan, especially now that you're out of tricks. I can't leave this alone, Sildra told him. Morgus himself granted me a quest to liberate this town from this corruption. I need to find Mom. After what happened with Loon, can Morgus make it so your skills function during the day? because that would make this all a whole lot easier. They were crouched on the roof of a house one street over, just behind the peak. As far as Sildra could tell, there wasn't a person left in the town anywhere but right in front of Town Hall. Maybe a few holdouts had barricaded themselves in their homes, but there was nobody and nothing but monsters outside, and almost all of them were concentrated right in front of them. "I think there are some behind the building," she said. "At least, there were back when I could still track their locations. Maybe we can hit them from the other side, thin out some numbers. If we're quick and quiet enough, we might even be able to get inside and rescue any prisoners." "Do you really think there are prisoners? Monsters don't usually keep humans alive. Why else would they be guarding Town Hall? It's not like they care about tax records, right?" "I have no idea what they care about. Monsters that look like people are new to me. Monsters don't talk. They rarely work together. They never have plots or schemes. Well, these ones do. I'm going to circle around and see if there's an opening from the back. You can stay or go," she said. Before Jensen could argue, she slid down the roof and started climbing back to the street. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. This woman is going to get me killed. Maybe if Torwin were here, it'd be easy. He's gold ranked. He could just stand there and blow the whole horde away before they even started moving. Why am I even still here? If she's so determined to throw her life away, the smart thing for me to do is get as far away as possible. Despite his musings, he found himself following Sildra in a wide loop around the town anyway. He tried to tell himself it was curiosity, or that finding out what these monsters were up to was important to the security of the whole country. An infestation like this could spread, and the last thing they needed were thousands of monsters infiltrating cities disguised as humans. Those were certainly valid reasons, but if he were being honest with himself, the truth was simpler than that. He liked Sildra. She was brash and headstrong and uneducated, exactly the sort of person he'd been raised to steer well clear of. She was also honest and straightforward and remarkably strong in the right circumstances. They hadn't known each other long, but she was almost a friend, maybe more like an annoying little sister. So he strode along after her, bout at the ready, and eyes peeled for any monsters that might come bursting out of the shadows. They were going off Sildra's memories of where the monsters had been 15 minutes ago, but those things had a tendency to move, so he was being extra careful. Really, unless they came at him in numbers, his biggest concern was that he'd accidentally shoot a person he mistook for a monster. The trip was surprisingly quiet and only took about 10 minutes. They soon found themselves perched on a different roof, this time looking at the back of the building. Sildra's mouth hung open as she stared in horror, and even though he wasn't personally invested in this whole thing, Jensen found himself silently agreeing with her. The grass was stained with blood, and not just in one spot. It looked like a dozen people had been murdered, then strung up and left to bleed out. It splattered the walls of the town hall and stained the edge of the streets where the grass ended. That would have been disturbing enough on its own, but piles of organs and meat decorated the yard, macabre little mounds that he could smell from 100 feet away. "What are they doing back here?" Sildra whispered, her eyes wild. "There are no bodies, but hollowing out people," Jensen said. "Think about it. These monsters, they're not random bodies. They're your neighbors. You know these people. Each one is a skin suit with something sitting inside it. That's why the system notifications don't say we're killing humans. They're already dead. The only thing left is the monster controlling their corpse. We have to get in there and save whoever's still alive. Easy to say, but not to do. Who's to say there's even anybody left?" He kept his mouth shut, though. This was personal to Sildra. She wasn't going to let it go, which meant he needed to decide if he was going to leave her to die or try to help her. He wanted to stay, but the sad truth of the matter was that the most likely outcome was that they both died instead of just her. The only ways this works is if it's a running battle where I pick them off one by one while they chase me, or if we manage to sneak inside without the ones out front knowing about it. I can't see either plan working. Maybe both? If I act as a decoy, kill some at the front, get the rest to run off, Sildra could get inside. While he was mulling over his options, the back door opened. Two men came out, both covered in dried blood. Both had the hardy frames of loggers, though neither carried the axes he'd seen other corrupted humans carrying. Instead, they dragged a third man who looked to be about the same age as Jensen and Sildra between them. "That's Demos," she said. The ones holding him are Jack and Teve. Demos hung limp in their grip, possibly unconscious. His heels dragged across the ground, limp and unresisting as they flung him into a relatively clean spot in the yard. Seemingly uncaring, the two loggers turned and disappeared back into the town hall. What was that about? Jensen whispered. No idea. A few seconds later, Demos started convulsing. Blood bubbled up between his lips and spilled across his face. His eyes flew open, and with a choked, coughing gasp, he clutched at his chest. Even from so far away, Jensen could see his throat bulge, as if something were stuck inside it. A moment later, he hacked out a blob of tissue, soaked in blood. Immediately, the process started over, and a second blob joined the pile. Are those his lungs? Jensen asked. Morgus's great hairy balls. What is happening here? He thought better of the curse the moment he uttered it. But the druid, dedicated to Morgus sitting right next to him, was too preoccupied to say anything. She just stared, horrified, as the young man lying in the lawn hacked up organ after organ, almost like something was inside his chest, forcing them out. A minute later, there was another pile of shredded meat in the yard to match the many others. Demos stood up, covered in his own blood, and casually walked back into the town hall like nothing had happened. He didn't even bother to wipe his face, not that there was any clean spot left on his shirt to use in the first place. I know your skill isn't working so well with the sun being up now, Jensen said, but is there any chance you can tell whether that guy just turned into a monster? Because I'm pretty sure we just saw someone become a corrupted seed bearer. Sildra wasn't listening to him, though. 14, 15, 16, 22, 23. Gods, at least that many people they put through this. Jensen thought back to the people standing on the street in front of the town hall, to the butcher Sildra had known personally, and the ones out in the woods just outside of town. None of them had been covered in blood like Demos. They were new converts, and this town wasn't the only place that was infested. He'd already killed 24 corrupted seed bearers when he'd encountered a logging team out in the woods on his way back to the inn. How long has this been going on? How widespread is it already? Will there even be anyone left alive in the other towns now? Velik didn't get a lot of sleep, but then again, he didn't need much anymore. The higher his physical stat got, the less he seemed to even get tired, and the quicker he woke back up. 4 to 6 hours had been his average a few years ago, with that inching closer to 3 the higher his level grew. In the last 6 months, he'd seen a huge leap in his stats, and now even 3 hours felt like overkill. Torwin must have been in a similar position, or maybe it was some sort of skill in his case. The old man probably had 30 or more skills rolled up into however many slots he had open. Whatever the reason was, they both got about 2 hours of sleep and were up shortly after dawn. What actually woke Velik was the smell of cooking meat, which sent a brief surge of panic through him before he remembered he was sharing camp with someone else. You'll draw in monsters cooking out here like that, he said. Good morning to you too, Torwin replied. And what's wrong with baiting the monsters in? The whole point is to kill them. Preferably not while I'm asleep, Velik said. Some things are worth it for a good breakfast. Hard to argue with that logic. That smells delicious. He must have picked up a cooking skill at some point. As much of a hurry as they were in, Velik gave in to temptation and had a leisurely morning. Half an hour wouldn't change things one way or another, and it wasn't like Torwin's lazy apprentice was hard at work. If that guy could sleep 10 hours a day, Velik could take half an hour to enjoy a well-cooked campfire meal. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Worst morning ever, Jensen panted as he sprinted away from the horde of monsters. He'd explained his plan to Sildra, emphasizing the danger she'd be in going into the building alone. They'd both agreed that it was their best shot at rescuing anyone who might still be alive, and that was that. An hour past dawn, an ungodly hour during which he shouldn't have even been awake, saw him running full speed down the unfamiliar streets of an unimportant town tucked away at the back edge of civilization, 24 monsters in pursuit. He'd targeted the monsters he knew were fastest for his ambush. As far as he could tell, the main ability of the seed bearers was to take over a host and blend in, which left them with whatever stats the body they'd moved into had. That meant he could outrun any of them. It was some of the faster monsters that he was concerned about. that and how well they'd coordinate to box him in. He couldn't just make a break for the open gate. He had to keep them chasing him, or else they might return to the town hall and find Sildra. He juked left around a corner and silently cursed when a pair of wargs cut out in front of him. This is exactly what I didn't want to happen. There was nothing for it but to bring his bow up and attempt a shot on the run, a feat made even more difficult by the fact that the wargs didn't just stand there and wait for him to get things lined up. Both of them came at him at a full run, teeth flashing in the morning light as they lunged. The closest warg ate an arrow, a shot Jensen was more than pleased with. Even if he did suspect, it was more a combination of luck and the aiming enchantments than through any personal growth in his skill. He darted to the side before the second warg could catch him, then spun on his heel and fired 2 shots into its flank as it went by. The warg he'd shot in the mouth died, but its partner was up for another round. Unfortunately, Jensen was out of time. With a bit of luck, its injuries would slow it down enough that it wouldn't catch up again. He ran off, his feet moving so fast that they were almost a blur to his pursuers. I probably killed 7 or 8 of them, I think. No time to check the notifications and count them all up now, but it's a start. A glance over his shoulder showed him only a dozen corrupted seed bearers chasing him, along with the 1 remaining warg. That was a problem, as it meant the group had split up and he didn't know if they were trying to pincer him or returning to the town hall. Now he had to find them without running into them and getting caught. He fired off a few arrows into the mob and rounded another corner, desperately trying to figure out where the rest of the monsters had gone. On a quiet morning, he might have been able to track them by ear alone, but over the sound of shouting and his own labored breathing, he had a little trouble hearing anything else. Oh shit. 3 men jumped out in front of him, forcing him to veer to the right and duck under a swinging axe. Jensen dove into a roll and came back up. An arrow materialized and knocked on the string. He only had a split second to make a decision. The closest one was still recovering from a swing, but the monster next to him was already stepping forward. Which one recovers first? He didn't know the answer, but the man recovering from his missed attack wasn't in a position to defend himself. Jensen released the arrow and saw it appear in the monster's throat as if by magic. He caught the flash of a system notification, but ignored it to focus on the immediate threat. The second monster's axe flashed down and struck the paving stones right where Jensen had been a fraction of a second ago. He rolled, summoned another arrow, and fired point-blank into the man's chest. The third man wasn't content to sit idly by, but he was the worst positioned of the 3, and his advance had been blocked by the middleman. By the time he was close enough to strike, Jensen was already back on his feet and running. He leaped into the air, pirouette, and fired off another arrow. The shot went wide, barely scratching his target's hip and not doing much to slow it down. Jensen wasn't a melee fighter. He turned and ran, only to stumble when he saw 6 more seed bearers spilling out from between the houses. Shit, I guess it's good that they're all still here, but they got me surrounded. What'd I do now? Much as he detested the idea of wasting on a fight he shouldn't even have been involved in, it looked like he was going to have to use his most powerful ability: money. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The smell was so much worse up close, and the squelch of the wet ground underfoot was nauseating. Sildra crossed the human offal as quickly as she could, the stolen woodsman's axe clutched tightly in her hands. With every step, she expected the door to bang open and another of the corrupted seed-bearers to rush out. That didn't happen. She stopped at the door without any sign that a single person or monster had noticed her approach. Everything was silent. Even listening with her ear to the door revealed nothing. So Sildra screwed up her courage and eased it open. The inside of the town hall looked much as she'd remembered it, except for the fact that there were 30 or 40 people laid out in rows on the floor of the main assembly hall. Demos was at the far end of the room, covered in blood, just like everyone else. Without Eye of the Moon to confirm it, she couldn't be sure that they were all monsters, but it seemed likely. Sildra spied on them from an adjoining hallway, careful to make sure no one was looking in her direction. That caution was probably the only reason she noticed Jack crossing the room in her direction with a small, thumb-sized piece of what looked like fruit held in one hand. If he'd spotted her, he'd have made more noise, so she slipped back away from the assembly hall and ducked into one of the nearby rooms. With her ear pressed to the door, she listened for the sound of him passing by, but his footsteps stopped right in front of her. "Keep walking," she mentally begged him. "There's nothing interesting in here." That thought spurred her to glance around, where she was horrified to see her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Koru, tied to a table. The old woman was wide-eyed and gagged, staring back at Sildra, but unable to move or make a sound. Both of their gazes shifted simultaneously to the doorknob as it started to turn. "No choice. I gotta take him out in one hit, so he can't raise the alarm." She took a single long step into the corner behind the door, raised her axe, and held her breath. A second later, the door swung open and Jack stepped through. "See, your host is ready," he said, holding up the piece of fruit to Mrs. Koru. "Is that what's killing people? They are called corrupted seed bearers, after all." Jack took 2 more steps in, clearing the door completely, and Sildra made her move. Maybe it was movement caught out of the corner of his eye, or maybe it was the sound of her foot on the floor, but either way, Jack started to turn toward her. The axe bit deeply into his neck, spraying the room and Sildra both with blood. With a heave, she jerked it free and swung again. Jack ignored the wound and reached up a hand to grab the axe, but she was too quick. This time, his head flew clean off and his body dropped where he'd stood. "You have slain a corrupted seed bearer, level 16. The little red fruit rolled out of his slack grasp. Sildra watched it wobble, almost like it was alive, then stomped hard on it. "You have slain a seed of corruption, level 1. "Come on," Sildra said, approaching Mrs. Koru with the bloody axe. "Let's get these ropes off you and get you out of here." Spending Dekarmas on gear was one thing. Even the compass was justifiable, and that was before considering that it had proved useful enough that Jensen's master had borrowed it. Wasting it on disposables because he'd gotten himself backed into a corner was a different story. His father wasn't going to be happy, but that would only be a problem if Jensen was alive to hear the old man complain about it. So he didn't hesitate. Internally wincing, he bought 3 alchemical bombs from the system store for 2,000 Dekarmas each, more than 10 times what an alchemist could have charged him. But an alchemist couldn't make the bombs appear in his hands, and that was what he needed. The first one went back down the street to the approaching mob, where it could do the most damage and hopefully slow them down. It exploded, igniting the air in a bloom of fire that shot up higher than the roofs. Monsters were hurled in every direction, including toward Jensen. Fortunately, they were in no condition to do anything remotely resembling threatening. Maybe I can convince Master Torwin to part with one of those champion seeds and recoup the cost. Then Dad never has to know. The other 2 bombs went to the crowd in front of him. They were scattered, too far apart for even a pair of explosions to catch them all. Jensen got maybe half of them, judging by the cascade of notifications the system dropped on him, but the ones still alive were injured. Before he could take action to finish any of the monsters off, the house to his right groaned alarmingly. It had a huge chunk of wood missing from the side, enough that the front was starting to sag. The more it tilted forward, the faster it shifted. Oh hell! Jensen took off at a run, picking a path that led him away from the collapsing house and through the depleted ranks of the monsters. He made 40 or 50 feet before a great boom shook the entire street. Chunks of flying stone and would fill the air as a dust cloud rolled outward. 8 more kill notifications all came in on top of each other. I guess the system counts a house dropping on them as my fault, he thought with a wry smile. A few of the ones from the pursuing mob that had been thrown backwards by his first bomb were just now climbing to their feet, all of them relatively uninjured due to either distance or just a high physical stat. There were probably a handful on the other side of the wreckage as well, but Jensen was less concerned about them for the moment. Now that he'd evened the odds a bit, he thought he could probably finish off the leftovers. His bow came up, an arrow appeared on the string, and he got to work. You have advanced to level 20. +1 physical, +1 free point. You have unlocked a new class skill slot. A class evolution is available. The first 2 notifications weren't a surprise. He'd known he was going to level up again any time now, and winning a fight against so many monsters had been enough to push him over the edge. The third notification, though, was a different story. He was almost afraid to open it up and see what the options were. Torwin had seemed convinced that Ranger wouldn't be among them, and that Jensen should focus his efforts elsewhere. There were still monsters alive, so he resisted the temptation to investigate the prompt. Later, once he was safe, he'd see what his choices were. It would probably be best to wait for Torwin to return before making a decision, but it wouldn't hurt to take some time to form his own thoughts. Before that, he needed to pick off the survivors and then get back to the town hall. I hope I didn't screw anything up for her when I dropped that house. There's no way they didn't hear that all over town. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. It was quickly becoming apparent that whatever this business with the corrupted seeds was, today was merely the culmination of months or years of work. There were plenty of uninfected people, but they were all non-combatants. More than that, they were classes that used tools, not weapons. The watch had all been taken over. All the logging crews were in the same state. Anyone who had jobs that had anything to do with monsters, even incidentally, seemed to have been targeted. That left a lot of farmers, carpenters, cooks, and seamstresses in town, and Sildra had already saved a dozen of them held in individual rooms. They'd all been tied to a table like Mrs. Koru, and through them, Sildra had learned where the rest of the town was. In hindsight, it wasn't that surprising that the corrupted seed-bearers had stuffed their prisoners in the town's jail, except for the fact that there were only 5 cells, and they'd stuffed hundreds of people into them. Townsfolk had been dragged out of their beds in the middle of the night, either through some sort of lie if the attacker was someone they trusted, or just by raw force if there wasn't a corrupted person close to them. They'd been shoved into cells, packed shoulder to shoulder, and when they'd run out of room, they'd locked the overflow into small offices and put guards on them. A few people had been killed trying to fight back, but the corrupted faction of the town had overwhelmed them before any real resistance could form. They were debating how best to overwhelm the corrupted seed-bearers left to guard the prisoners, a difficult proposition considering Sildra's axe was the only weapon they had between them, when a bone-rattling crash shook the whole building. Everything immediately went wrong at that point. Some people panicked and ran for the door. Others started yelling for everyone else to calm down, inadvertently drawing the attention of the guards in the process. 2 of them rushed down the hall, saw the freed prisoners, and immediately attacked. The closest human found himself skewered on a spear before anyone could react. Then the fighting started for real. Sildra found herself caught in a press of bodies as some people surged forward to attack the monsters and others tried to flee to safety. As the only person with an actual weapon, she'd have thought the rescued prisoners would make way for her to get to the fight, but that wasn't the case. By the time she got to the forefront, both of the monsters were dead, along with 4 other people. The only upside to the fiasco was that it brought their weapon count from 1 to 3, not that either of the 2 men who claimed those wood-cutting axes knew much about how to use them in a fight. Splitting a log on a stump was not the same as a battle to the death with a monster that looked like one of their neighbors. The other unfortunate side effect was that about half the people who'd been laying on the floor in the assembly hall were up and on their feet now. It seemed that whatever toll the transformation took on them, they recovered from it quite quickly. The remaining members of the town watch were organizing and arming them, which left Sildra's group of 9 townsfolk with 3 axes up against about 25 monsters, all of whom had either a spear or an axe. Their only options were to retreat or to fight, and with everyone having a loved one still stuffed in one of those jail cells, there was very little argument about which course to take. "We're falling back," she ordered. "We need reinforcements and weapons, and we're not going to find either here. Head out the back, stick together, arm yourselves, and we'll regroup at the general store down the street." There was some harshly whispered arguing, but in the end, no one thought they could stand up to 30 or more monsters with just 3 axes and no real combat experience besides Sildra's. As soon as she explained that her skills only worked when the moon was up and that she was no stronger than anyone else right now, what little fight they had left went out of them. She could only hope that Jensen had been successful, that the booming sound was his doing, and that it meant good news. Much as she hated to admit it, without his help, she didn't see a way to rescue everyone else. Short of getting a pickaxe and digging a tunnel from the nearest cellar, there was no way to get under town hall and into those cells without crossing the assembly room, which meant a ridiculously one-sided fight. Maybe a window I can come in through. No, the stairs going up and down are at the back of the hall. If I came in from the second floor, I could take the staircase directly down. I wouldn't have to cross the floor then, just go down a single flight of stairs. It's possible nobody would notice. That's assuming there aren't more of them upstairs, though. I have no idea what's going on up there. Every plan had risks, so many that she couldn't see any that didn't end with her getting killed. Even now, with what she'd already done, there was a chance the monsters would kill their remaining prisoners. She was hoping the bodies were too valuable alive, but that hope was based on the idea that they needed somebody who was still breathing to put one of their seeds in. Everything she'd seen so far supported that idea, but there was so much Sildra didn't know. It was a risk doing what she'd done, but she'd saved 8 people by taking it. And she'd confirmed that her mother wasn't among the corrupted, which meant she was probably in a cell. She couldn't give up, not as long as there was a chance, but she had to admit she didn't have a clue how to proceed. It was a lot easier to kill a champion with another person helping, even if they were doing it during the day when Velik was at his weakest. So far, they'd managed 4, and it wasn't even noon yet. They were trading off who got to keep the seed, and a greedy little part of Velik had awoken. Torwin had described some of the more useful tools and gear for a hunter, things that Velik hadn't known existed, but which he now desperately wanted. Extra-dimensional storage is my next big purchase, Torwin told him. It's ruinously expensive, though, and it's a constant drain on your magic. You can't even power it without a high enough mystic stat. But it's so useful. It certainly sounded handy, but at 100,000 dekarmos, just for a space the size of a backpack, it'd be a long, long time before Velik purchased any for himself. There were so many useful things he could pick up for a small fraction of that price. Things that would make him stronger and let him hunt more powerful monsters safely. Torwin stopped abruptly and made a halting motion with his hand. "Trouble back at town," he said. Jensen spent the dekarmos to buy a whispering wind. "One moment. What's a whispering wind?" While he waited, Velik decided to look it up. The store had a search function, and it was easy enough to find exactly what that was. For the price of 3,000 dekarmos. It was a piece of alchemy comprised of some sort of air spirit trapped in a bottle. The user whispered their message into it, then released the spirit to fly to the addressee. With some limitations, the spirit would seek that person out and deliver the message. There had to be cheaper methods of long-distance communication, but Velik wasn't paying for it, so he just gave a mental shrug and chalked it up to the wastefulness of the nobility. He'd already known Jensen's family was rich, so it didn't much surprise him that he'd throw away huge sums of money on stuff like this. Whatever the message was, Torwin's face grew more and more grim. "The towns are under attack," he finally said. "Not by a horde of monsters, but by those seed bearers we found, except they're inside humans. From what they can tell, they've been there for a while, months at least. Deshur was completely taken over, and they're struggling to rescue the humans who haven't been turned into monsters yet. And Jensen thinks the other towns are in a similar state." "Chalin, did you do this too?" "We might need to split up," the old hunter said. "One of us keeps going, the other goes back and rescues the towns." Part of Velik demanded that he immediately start heading south. He'd been protecting those towns against the encroaching monsters for years, and just when he'd finally thought he was close to finding the source, something like this happened. He'd left their safety in the hands of an apprentice who'd failed to do the job. But to be fair, it wasn't exactly a monster horde sweeping out of the forest. If he was right, the corrupted seed bearers had been building up their numbers long before Velik had left. The other part wanted to press on, to find answers in his childhood friend. He was so close to finally resolving an issue that had plagued the frontier for a decade, an issue that, despite everything, he felt responsible for. Logically, he knew he'd been a child and that it wasn't his fault, but the fact remained that if he and Chalin hadn't gone in that old, ruined dungeon and found that class orb, or whatever it truly was, then none of this would have happened. Intentional or not, they'd set off the chain of events that had led to the current problems. "I could make it back in 3 days if I pushed and didn't stop for sleep," Velik said. "Maybe less if I don't run into too many monsters. Logically, it'd probably be better if you went back and I kept going. I'm a higher level and more experienced with this type of work. However, that's my apprentice calling for help. I have an obligation. Additionally, If this infestation is producing monsters that can infiltrate towns, I'm going to need to start sending warning letters to other communities. No offense, but I don't think you have the knowledge to handle that task. I wouldn't even know where to start, Velik admitted. Torwin nodded unhappily. If we're lucky, this will be contained to the frontier towns. Best not to rely on luck too much, not if we don't have to. I'll go back, take care of the corrupted seeds, and get the region mobilized. If it's bad enough, I might even have to call the guild for reinforcements. And I'll keep following the compass until I reach the source. Hopefully I don't run into another level 40 champion. I'm sure I'm close to leveling up again, but I don't think 33 is going to be much better than 32. Maybe if I could get skill merger. He was no closer to that than when he'd started, unfortunately. Phalanx had seemed like a good idea at the time, but what he wanted and what the skill wanted weren't the same thing. Trying to twist it to meet his needs had been a mistake, and he wasn't sure how to find a middle ground that would allow him to incorporate it into his fighting style. Good luck, Torwin said softly. I'd hate to come back out here to find you dead. Be careful, and don't hesitate to run from a fight that's beyond you. When am I ever not careful? Didn't you solo a champion elite more than 10 levels higher than you yesterday night? Hey, I won, didn't I? You should have run, Torwin said flatly. These aren't meant to be fought alone. It's frankly insane that you're alive, no matter how strong your class is. There was some truth to that. Ending up inside that monster's mouth without getting chewed on had been a huge determining factor in his victory. Prior to that, Velik had struggled to even damage such a powerful monster. But that wasn't a strategy he was eager to repeat, so he had to acknowledge some wisdom in Torwin's advice. Then again, that particular champion's domain seemed to move with it for some reason, so he wasn't entirely sure escape had ever been an option, not that he'd tried all that hard to find out. Maybe I really am an idiot. But no, that thing had my name. It needed to die before Torwin saw it and started asking uncomfortable questions. I had good reasons to take the risks I did. I'll keep that in mind. Run fast. Keep everyone safe. I will, the old hunter said. Farewell for now. Find whatever's making these monsters and put an end to it. On that, they agreed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He was pleased with how well his seeds were doing. There'd been some resistance, of course. That was to be expected. Inroads had been made, but there was only so much subterfuge could accomplish before force was required. Perhaps, if he'd had more time. But no, the nodes were being severed. He'd already lost his connection with too many of his creations. New seeds would have to be made, and not the weak, numerous seeds that grew in clusters like grapes. Powerful seeds, the exemplars to all monsters, took time to craft. Sadly, that was a resource he suddenly found himself in short supply of. His guardian had been defeated, and more nodes were falling with each passing hour. Loath as he was to admit it, his strategy wasn't performing as well as expected when he'd begun this project. There'd been too much opposition, too many setbacks. His elites had never quite managed to secure the foothold he desired, and while the monsters he'd unleashed into the savage wildlands were surviving, they weren't truly thriving in the manner he'd envisioned. For all those other problems, the seeds that had reached the border between man and monster were doing remarkably well. 3 of the towns were resisting and would probably reclaim their homes with massive casualties. 1 had repelled the infestation easily, and the last, the one where he was most deeply entrenched, was likely to secure a total victory. That wasn't surprising. That town had served as his test site. He'd been sending his seed bearers there for over a year, slowly growing their ranks until they represented over a quarter of the town. He'd wanted to replicate that in the other towns, but the nodes being brought down had forced his hand, and he'd given the command early. Other than that one level 19 running around, causing problems, he hadn't anticipated much resistance. And in many respects, that had been a correct assumption. He'd merely erred in underestimating how much damage that level 19 could actually do. In the end, it didn't matter. The seeds were expendable. The nodes were expendable. Even the Guardian was expendable. He could replace them, and he would. Even if this attempt failed, he'd just start building resources for another one. He'd already spread far and wide into the wilderness. The kingdoms of man would fall as well. Despite his plans to save the champion's seeds to finance the rest of his life, The temptation to imbue his other piece of system gear with more power was almost overwhelming. The only thing that held Velik back was that his boots were the only viable target, and they weren't that great to begin with. He'd only purchased them for the mending enchantment, and only because he'd kept wearing through normal boots so quickly that it was becoming a hassle to keep replacing them. He'd already hunted down 3 more champions, which had resulted in another level, with his free points both spent in Mystic again, and a rank in both Apex Hunter and Spear Warden. His other 2 skills remained frustratingly stuck, though he got the feeling he was close to something happening with Kinetic Charge. As challenging as fighting champions that were 4 or 5 levels higher than him was, the battles weren't forcing him to adapt in new ways anymore. He needed something else to challenge him if he was going to keep growing. What that something would be, he wasn't yet sure. His newly empowered spear was making short work of normal monsters in the Deepwood now, and elites weren't so common that he ran into them regularly. Even the champions would be almost impossible to stumble across if not for the compass guiding him. It would probably work for elites too, and maybe he'd adjust the settings to hunt for them once he was done with his current project, but he doubted they'd provide the push he was looking for. He made good progress, but as the first week rolled by, he started to have concerns about his food supply again. Velik had no plans of returning before the matter was dealt with, if only because he was trusting Torwin to handle things back at the towns. The unfortunate truth was that he had no idea how close he was to finding the end of the trail he was following, and that if he'd known the precise locations of every champion he'd slain, he definitely could have planned a more efficient route. He continued to fiddle with the compass, but no matter how he changed it around, all it ended up doing was producing false positives, usually those related to non-champion monsters with skills that relied heavily on their mystic stat to power them. Sometimes the compass seemed to just draw him to a random place that was probably magical, but he couldn't tell. He spent some time poking around a pool of luminous green water, but he lacked the knowledge or tools to take samples and analyze them. At another spot, he found a granite post, 8 feet tall and a foot wide, that radiated heat so strongly that it would have burned his hand to touch it. Unsurprisingly, nothing grew within 20 feet of the post, and the ground was dried and cracked. It was at least obvious why the compass had pointed to it, but it wasn't immediately helpful. After that, he gave up again on fiddling with the compass's settings and turned it back to pointing him toward mana-dense monsters. That was why he was confused when, 4 hours later, he found what appeared to be another weird, mana-rich site. It was a hole in the side of the hill, perfectly round and 10 feet across. That would have been unusual enough on its own, but he could have dismissed the compass as merely pointing to a monster that was living underground. The truly strange part of it was that the walls weren't made of dirt and stone. The whole hill was like some giant scab caked with dirt, with the hole being a puncture into whatever titan was buried their soft flesh. If not for the fact that the compass pointed directly into that hole, Velik wouldn't have even considered going inside. Images of the walls constricting and crushing him danced through his mind. The compass didn't waver, and that meant this was his next destination. Until he destroyed whatever had made this fleshy cave its home, he was stuck. Before he went inside, though, he took full stock of himself and his equipment. Name, Velik. Race, human dustbound. Class, the Black Fang. Level, 33. Physical, 103 plus 18. Mental, 56 plus 2. Mystical, 28 plus 20. Free points, 0. Dekarma, 4,885. Skills, Apex Hunter, rank 3. Spear Warden, rank 7. Kinetic Charge, rank 3. Phalanx, rank 2. Gear, Harbinger of Dusk, plus 15 pH, plus 5 mi. Hunter's Cowl, plus 2 mi. Stalker's Boots, plus 3 pH. Survivalist Shirt. Self-Repairing Cloak. Mystic's Earring, plus 15 mi. Amulet of Stable Thoughts. There were 9 more champion seeds filling his inventory, in addition to his remaining 7 healing potions and 1 haste potion. The haste potion was system purchased, and he knew exactly how it would affect him. The potions, on the other hand, were handcrafted by alchemists. They worked, but not nearly as well as the ones he was used to buying. For the price, he couldn't really argue, but he was strongly considering keeping one system potion on him for emergencies. No, it's fine. I killed my counterpart without a system healing potion. I can kill whatever this is, too. He took a step in and hesitated when a gust of hot, moist air rolled past him. It's not like I'll never buy a system potion again. They don't go bad. Better to have it now, just in case. 1,000 dekarmos later, he slotted the system-produced healing potion into this pouch and entered the cave. The ground was softer than dirt, soft enough that he didn't want to try fighting on it. His foot probably wouldn't push through the material, but nobody liked having unstable footing when they were fighting for their life. If not for his high mental stat, he would have thought he was imagining it when the ground shifted under him, an ever so slight trembling that he almost didn't notice. But no, he could see it. Whatever this cave was, it was alive in some way. Maybe it was just magic, or maybe it really was some massive flesh and blood monstrosity buried under the earth. It was tempting to stab his spear into the wall to see if it bled before he went any deeper, but he was worried that doing that would make the cave clench up, blocking him from reaching whatever his compass was pointed at. No, this is too important. I have to know before I go in here. If it prevents me from getting at whatever this thing is I'm hunting, then so be it. Better to be locked out and have to find a new target than to get crushed to death by the walls during a battle. Backing all the way out, he reached out with his spear and pressed the point into the fleshy wall. At first, the wall dimpled, despite an impressive amount of pressure. Then, with an almost flatulent sigh, it gave way and the spear slipped inside a full foot before Velik encountered resistance. It felt like stone, hard enough to stop a casual strike, but not so dense that he couldn't cut through if he really tried. So, this is more of a layer of skin stretched across the tunnel than an actual creature buried underground. That's disgusting. Thick black blood seeped out of the wound he'd made, but far less than he'd expected. The moment he removed his spear, the cut clotted over into a scab. A few more tests confirmed the floor, and ceiling reacted the exact same way. The fleshy wall was just a mask disguising the natural stone beneath, which meant the odds of it suddenly coming alive and crushing him were low. Even better, it didn't seem to react to the prodding at all, other than to bleed thick, black monster blood for a second before sealing itself closed. No enemies showed themselves to investigate his prodding, either. There had to be more to the strange hole, but Velik was as assured of his safety as he could get, and he wouldn't find answers just standing around. Taking a deep breath, he walked into the tunnel and descended into the darkness. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Strange. Was a sensation. He turned his senses outward, through the vast network of veins and nerves stitched into his domain. It was easy enough to find the interloper. He'd often tracked the progress of his minions as they hauled in fresh material. None of them had ever damaged his body before, though. He had only vague recollection of the absence of pain, memories that weren't even really his. They were remnants of another life, and it had been years since he'd felt anything but the unending torture of his flesh warping and spreading. Even the thoughts he'd consumed were brief flickers of light in a sea of agony. He'd long since learned to disassociate from his body, returning to it only when necessary. Today, it appeared, would be one such day. Something approached. His central cluster was in danger, the one node that he couldn't afford to have broken. All danger was relative, though. He'd long since prepared for an intruder. At his mental comment, fleshy embryonic sacs split open, spilling out the guardian monsters he'd held in stasis for years. They took a few minutes to come fully awake and ready to fulfill their purpose, but that wasn't a problem. His cluster was hidden so far away from that entry that it would be hours before the intruder reached him even unimpeded. It would never come to that, but he did hope his creations could take the intruder alive. After all, there was no point in wasting such a prime specimen. There was no telling what he could reshape it into. Velik had never been underground before, but he had a high mental stat and the racial bonus from Duskbound to help him see in the dark. In the past, those had been enough to see clearly. Even a moonless night kept no secrets from his eyes, but he was quickly learning that there was a difference between the dark of night and an utter absence of light that came with being underground. For the first time since he'd gotten his hunter's cowl, the night vision enchantment on it was doing some good. Color was the first thing to go as he went deeper, and fine details had started to blur into shadows soon after that. But then the cowl got to work, and those details popped back out in pale white outlines. It wasn't as good as he was used to, but it was more than enough to navigate by. The tunnel itself was somewhat disgusting. The give in the floor as flesh dimpled under his feet disturbed Velik more than he cared to admit, like he was stepping on a boardwalk of living bodies all lashed together. The fact that the walls occasionally twitched and quivered did not help matters. The smell, though, that was the worst of it. It wasn't quite rotting meat, but it was foul nonetheless. Like being stuck in a prison pit full of criminals who haven't seen a bath in a year, he thought to himself. And no rain to clean them up, either. That was it. A sour, sickly stink of unwashed flesh tickled his nose and his mind. He'd smelled that stink somewhere before, but he couldn't for the life of him place it. The smell grew stronger the deeper he went. It never changed, though, not even when he stabbed the fleshy walls to confirm the thickness hadn't changed. His eyes might have relied on his cowl's enchantment to see, but his hearing wasn't hindered by being underground at all. If anything, the heightened sensitivity over a baseline human made it worse. He thought his footsteps were silent, so much so that he'd ranked up stealth several times and then folded it into another skill, but in the fleshy underground tunnel, he could hear the echoes of his own steps coming back to him. He paused at the first fork he came to. To this point, there'd been no other options beyond forward or back. It was impossible to get lost so long as he didn't get turned around, and even then, that would merely result in returning to the surface. Velik wasn't worried about that happening. He had an excellent sense of direction and knew precisely how far he'd walk down the tunnel. Admittedly, he wasn't a pro at sensing changes in elevation, so he wasn't sure how deep he'd gone, but a simple reverse direction going back 2 miles would see him under the night sky again. With a fork in the tunnels, however, he now had to make a decision. His compass was difficult to decipher. The setting's runes were completely invisible with night vision, but he could see the arrow pointing slightly to the left. He was just about to put the compass back in his pocket and take that fork when the arrow twinged to the right. Frowning, he looked down each tunnel to see if there was anything moving. Nothing. Probably. I don't hear anything, though, so what's wrong with the compass? Velik stood there for a minute, watching as the needle mostly pointed to the left, but occasionally flicked over to the right for a second before slipping back to its old heading. The only thing he could think of was that there were multiple monsters in close proximity, and the compass was having trouble deciding which one had more mana. It was either that or the damn thing was broken again. Standing around would get him nowhere, so he shrugged to himself, pocketed the compass, took up his spear, and started down the left fork. A few thousand feet later, he hit a 4-way intersection and again consulted his compass. Now it was swinging wildly from left to right and giving him no indication at all of which way the monster was. All it could tell him for sure was that going back wouldn't get him closer to his goal. Son of a... This thing's useless. If the compass wasn't going to guide him, he'd just have to find the monster himself, the old-fashioned way. His mental map of the tunnel network was far from complete, but he had a good idea of where he'd been and figured he knew where he was going. He'd just have to be thorough until he found what he was looking for. This tunnel to my right curves back the way I came. I bet that leads to the first fork, but it might have some other side tunnels in it. I'll check that first just to confirm, then see what my other options lead to. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. At first, he didn't hear the scratching sound over his own footsteps, but when Velik paused at the entrance to a wide cave to make sure he wasn't walking into a trap, it became clear. There were too many echoes of something that was too soft to track anyway, and he couldn't tell if the noise was in front of him or behind him, but he suspected the answer might be both. 2 enemies would have the advantage in the tunnels, where he'd be forced to fight, turn to the side, to keep an eye on both of them. His reactions would be slow, and he'd be reaching across his body with every attack. It would be better to move into the open cavern, where he could put his superior maneuverability to use. However, if this was where the champion's domain was, the last thing he wanted was to engage it while dealing with additional enemies. A quick check of his compass showed him that the mana source he was looking for was everywhere, apparently. The needle was spinning all the way around in a continuous circle. There was only one solution: backtracking. If there was something behind him, he'd hit it hard and dispose of it before anything else caught up. If it was ahead of him, then he'd deal with it when it caught up with him. If there were more than one of them, then he'd made the right call. Decision made. He swiftly retreated from the cavern. Every few hundred feet, he paused to listen for the scratching sound, which was steadily growing louder. Getting a lock on its location was tricky with the echoes, which were weirdly distorted by the soft, fleshy walls. Velik wasn't confident he could have followed them even in a normal tunnel, though, so he didn't worry about it too much. As it turned out, he didn't need to worry about tracking the source of the scratching sound. It found him. A monster came trundling around a curve in the tunnel, a foot tall for feet long, and with a curling tail twice that long sticking out of its back end. A wickedly curved stinger topped that tail. Small pincers, barely big enough to give a decent handshake, came off the front, and it had 6 skittering legs to propel it. Every step it took produced the scratchy sound he'd been hearing, and with so many legs, it was no wonder he'd had a hard time figuring out what he was hearing. It approached fearlessly, cutting across the tunnel and angling straight for Velik. How does it see? This thing doesn't even have eyes. There was a mouth between the arms that ended in pincers, but no other features beyond that. Eyes, nose, ears, all were absent. There wasn't even an antenna of any sort to guide it. Unfortunately, Velik didn't get any more time to study it before it was on him, its leading pincer reaching out to clamp onto his leg. He faded back a step and started to bring his spear down in a sharp stab, only to spin it back up to deflect a swift jab from its stinger. The tunnel wasn't really wide enough to give him the full range of motion he was used to, so he shortened his spear and switched to a style of lunge and retreat motions designed to strike at the monster while it was recovering from its own attacks. Velik wasn't sure if that stinger was venomous, but he wasn't eager to find out. Even if it wasn't, it wouldn't do him any good to let the monster poke a few holes in him. It seemed to be far clumsier with its pincers than with the stinger, so he flicked his spear out, extending its length 3 full feet as he moved, and stabbed the head into the base of the tail. Severing those muscles seemed to do the trick. Its tail flailed back and forth wildly, the barb at the end whipping through the air with a soft whistle, but without the needed motor control, it was only a matter of a few seconds before it flopped down to drag behind the monster. Now, with only its pincers to deal with, Velik had a far easier time jabbing his spear into its armored carapace. A few applications of kinetic charge were enough to finish it off, though even after death, it kept twitching. You have slain a black-hide scorpling, level 33. Velik wasn't sure what a scorpling was, but he hoped they didn't get much bigger than that one. It wouldn't have been a particularly challenging fight above ground, but being forced to rely on night vision and fight in cramped tunnels was a bit of a handicap. The fight had only taken 30 seconds, which was good because he could still hear scratching sounds coming down the tunnels. The scorpling he'd killed finally stopped twitching, but the noise didn't end. If anything, it was even louder than before. No chance there's only 2 of these things, is there? He thought with a sigh. And that's 8, 9, and 10. How many more of these damn things are there? The scorplings weren't so bad one at a time, but the last batch had been 3 of them, and they'd come at him from both sides. Only his enhanced agility had kept him safe from being caught in those pincers and stung to death. To be fair, he hadn't actually been hit yet, but he wasn't willing to bet on the durability of his skin to resist monsters in the mid-30s level range. The worst part was that the scratching sound they made when they walked wasn't getting any quieter. If anything, more and more of the monsters were showing up. No, the worst thing is that those stingers are definitely poisoned. It turned out that the flesh walls really were flesh in all the ways that counted, and more than once one of the scorpling stingers had scratched the wall or floor. The flesh had immediately started to putrefy, and even though the effect hadn't spread that far from the injection site, that was relative to the size of the wall. A few feet in every direction might as well be Velik's whole body, and he had a human circulatory system. The wall was full of thick monster blood that barely even oozed out of any wounds it took. He'd already looked up the price of an all-purpose antidote in the system store and wasn't in a hurry to drop 1,500 dekarmos on it if he didn't need to, so avoiding the stingers was a high priority. His early strategy of severing the muscles at the base of the tail was still working, but that was a lot harder to pull off when there were three of them all coming at him in a tight tunnel. He was seriously considering retreating back to the cavern he'd discovered and risking dealing with a champion just so he'd have room to move when the next batch of scorplings found him. There's a solid chance of that plan backfiring on him and making things worse, but if he did nothing, he'd eventually make a mistake. Maybe that would be because he was tired. Maybe it would be because the next group would have 4 or even 5 scorplings. Or maybe he'd simply run out of time and his duskbound bonuses would expire with a rising sun he couldn't see. There could be hundreds or even thousands of these things down here. If he wanted to move forward, he needed to take the risk. Otherwise, the best thing for him to do was fight his way back to the surface and abandon the whole plan. No way. Another scorpling found him while he was backtracking to the cavern, leaving him to once again wonder what weird senses they had that allowed them to track him down. Apex Hunter was usually good about figuring that stuff out, but these monsters were too foreign for him to piece it together. Maybe it's some sort of scent tracking? But then how do they fight once they actually catch up? Even without eyes, they seem to have some sort of sight analog. They weren't graceful by any means, else one of them would have tagged him long ago, but they at least attempted to block his spear when he stabbed at them. If they couldn't see him, he couldn't think of another way they'd be able to tell where the spear was when he was swinging it around. He was hustling toward an intersection with 5 possible exits when the next scorpling appeared in front of him. At the same time, 2 poured out of the tunnel he'd just passed. "Great," he muttered. 2 more joined the one in front of him, flanking it on either side. 5. With no time to waste, Velik turned on his heel and rushed back to where there were only 2. He needed to either kill both of them or at least find a way past them, so all his enemies were on one side in the next few seconds. The first scorpling snapped at him as he approached, but he kicked off the wall, smacked its tail aside with his spear, and landed behind it. Immediately, its partner jabbed at him with its tail. Velik hopped back a step to dodge it, but before he could start moving again, the first scorpling smacked into him. Thankfully, it was more of a body check than anything. Its pincers and stinger were far enough away that all he felt was the mass of its central body and 2 of its legs kicking against his foot. That was enough to force him to stumble a single step, which was all the second scorpling needed to get a pincer around his leg. Velik flexed his thigh muscles hard to prevent the pincer from tearing into him, but that wasn't the real problem. The issue was that, now that he was stuck in place, he was an easy target. All of his spear work went to batting aside the pincer that danced about, trying to drive itself into his chest. He blocked 3 strikes in less than a second, and by that time, the other scorpling had reoriented itself and joined the fight. No choice. Going to have to use it. Phalanx activated, and 4 softly glowing spears appeared around Velik. They cast a faint light, barely enough to highlight the lengths of their halves in the dark, but to Velik's eyes, everything was suddenly bright enough for his native dark vision to kick in. Sketchy details became clear and colors returned. Not that he had time to appreciate them. His control with Phalanx was better now, but still not great. He didn't want to trust his life to it, but until he got free from the pincer holding him, he needed a way to block multiple attacks at once. This was precisely the type of situation the skill was designed to handle, so he hoped it was up to the task. The scorpling's exoskeletons were tough enough that he didn't see the phantasmal spears putting any holes in them unless he imbued them with kinetic charge. A tail flashed down on his left, and he willed a spear to smack it to the side. The scorpling's attack was knocked off course, but it recovered quickly and tried again. Velik defended himself, while the other 3 spears tied up the scorpling that had gotten a hold of him. His real weapon, the Harbinger of Dusk, shortened to 4 feet in length, and he drove it into the pincer, holding him with all his might. Pain radiated from his leg where it dug deeper, but his attack had done its work. One side of the pincer was sheared off, leaving Velik free to move. He danced back out of range, leaving Phalanx to delay both monsters. That's actually working pretty well. These things aren't coordinated, just fast. I should have tried this earlier. The other 3 scorplings reached the fight then, but with a tunnel too narrow for all of them to get through, that ended up helping Velik. Unlike other pack monsters he'd fought in the past, These ones didn't work together at all. They didn't outright attack each other, but the ones in the back didn't hesitate to climb on top of their brethren, trying to reach Velik. That didn't do much for the front line's capabilities, but it did give him plenty of openings. Things are going well. He killed one, then another of the scorplings. The remaining 3 all had injuries on them, slowing them down, and, more importantly, preventing them from using their tails freely. Phalanx was working well, despite the soft light coming from the spears messing with his night vision enchantment. It couldn't seem to decide if it needed to be active or not, and as a result his vision kept flickering between the strange white outlines of things and his normal sight. That might have been the reason he missed a 6th scorpling coming up from behind. It certainly didn't help either way. Whether it was that or the distraction of fending off a trio of monsters while directing 4 phantasmal spears at the same time, the end result was the same. He heard the soft swish of a descending stinger, had a moment to register that none of the ones in front of him were responsible for the sound, and felt a burning pain in his shoulder as one of the monsters finally got a hit on him. Velik jerked away, but it was too late. Even as the stinger slipped out of him, the pain intensified and the burns started to spread. "Ark!" he cried out, unable to help himself. His arm dropped uselessly, still on fire but no longer listening to his body. Phalanx worked overtime for the next few seconds while he got his spear into his other hand and his back to a wall. The new scorpling clacked its pincers as it chased him down, and the 3 from the start of the fight worked in concert. Probably accidentally, considering what he'd seen of their pack tactics, to pen him in. Velik slashed the air in front of him, tried to drive them back. The blade of his spear skipped off one of the scorplings, its tough skin preventing it from drawing blood. At the same time, the poison spread down from his shoulder into his chest, and his heart started slamming into his ribs. Well, shit. That's probably not good. Should have bought that antidote before I needed it. Velik kept the monsters at bay for another few moments with Phalanx while he tried to figure out what to do. The first priority was removing the poison in his system, obviously, but getting through the store menus to buy the anti-venom while in active combat was a risk. He thought he could hold out another minute or 2 while he finished the fight, then take care of it afterwards. His next priority was the new addition. Unlike the other scorplings, this one was relatively small with a glossy black body and an oversized stinger. Something was different about it, and if he had to guess, he'd say it was specialized for stealth and the lethality of its venom. Maybe speed, too. Little bastard is hard to hit. Unlike its bigger cousins, the new scorpling adeptly dodged Velik's strikes. Even with Phalanx working in conjunction with Spear Warden to hem it in, it still managed to keep ahead of him. He knew he could kill it in ideal circumstances, but with the poison burning through him and 3 other monsters all demanding his attention at the same time, the little scorpling was proving itself too fast to keep pinned down. Velik shifted his strategy. 2 phantasmal spears went to keeping the small scorpling away from him. The other 2 were split among the remaining 3, and he focused his own weapon on getting a killing blow on them. It took about 20 seconds and dozens of exchanges, but he found an opportunity to use kinetic charge to slip his spear through the pincers of the middle one. It stabbed into the monster's mouth and past its teeth, twisting as he rotated his wrist to do maximum damage. The system notification flashed through his mind, confirming the kill, and Velik jerked his spear back. With one of the monsters dead, he was quickly able to disable a second one. That left only 2 in fighting shape, which was apparently not good enough odds for the small one to keep up the fight. It broke off and tried to skitter down the tunnel, but there was no way he was letting it escape. The risk of it showing back up and stabbing him in the back again was too great. At the same time, there was a strong temptation to let it run, finish off the last scorpling here, and then get his antidote from the system store. The pain had spread all the way across his chest, and he could feel his heartbeat slowing down with each passing moment. It was harder and harder for his lungs to pull in air, so much so that he was getting concerned he'd pass out soon. If that happened, he didn't think he'd wake back up. "I'll hunt you down," he silently promised the retreating scorpling. All 4 of his phantasmal spears put themselves between him and the remaining scorpling, and he frantically called up his system menu to access the store. The antidote wasn't hard to find again. and a few moments later, he was dodging a pincer, trying to clamp around his ankle while it materialized in his waiting hand. His spear was driven into the floor. The blade sunk deep into the fleshy coating, and he fumbled to remove the core from the vial, since he could no longer feel his other hand or anything else below the shoulder. Grimacing as he danced back, only his mind's control over phalanx, keeping the scorpling from rushing him, he tilted his head back and drank the liquid. It would be nice if this had come with some directions. I'll feel real stupid after I'm dead if I was supposed to pour this into the wound. Apex Hunter didn't have anything to say about him drinking it, though, so he was confident that was how he was supposed to use the antidote. It was too bad he didn't know exactly what kind of poison he'd been hit with, else he might have saved some Dekarmos narrowing down what he needed instead of grabbing the expensive all-purpose variety. But he wasn't about to scrimp on something he desperately needed to save his life. Whether or not it was working was too soon to tell. The symptoms weren't subsiding, but they also didn't seem to be getting worse. It was a struggle, but Velik could keep fighting. He drove the scorpling back with a flurry of phalanx strikes, then reclaimed his spear from where he'd planted it in the ground. With no other enemies left in front of him, he quickly killed it. It took only a moment to finish off the scorpling he'd disabled earlier. Then he spun in place and raced down the tunnel. "Where did you go, you sneaky little shit?" Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Velik was fully aware that most monsters possessed animal-like intelligence at best, but that every now and then, something smarter came along. Those are the worst ones to fight. They were unpredictable and adaptable, the kind of monsters he preferred to kill in one clean blow rather than get dragged into a long, drawn-out battle with. He suspected this scorpling was that kind of monster. The night vision enchantment he'd been using to navigate did a decent job of things. It was certainly better than being blind. However, what he hadn't realized until he'd regained the ability to distinguish fine details was that scorplings were incredibly easy to track. They left little scratches in the floor with their legs, if only because the floor was covered in 8 inches of skin. Night vision didn't show those scratches, but he could see them by the light of phalanx. The scorpling's trail was clear, and while Velik wasn't in good shape, physically, he was damn sure going to make sure he killed that monster. It wasn't just a burning desire for revenge, either. It had snuck up on him while he was fighting something else. He didn't want that happening again. The prudent thing to do was probably to find a place to rest for half an hour while the antidote did its work. He'd drunk a healing potion as well, which had helped with the pain in his chest and sealed up the hole in his shoulder, but hadn't done anything to restore feeling in his arm. He could kind of move it now, but it was more like flopping it around than anything coordinated. Retreat was the smart choice, but Velik didn't even consider it. There were too many advantages to killing the scorpling now while he could still track it, and too much risk to letting it live to ambush him again. Besides, it wasn't all that far ahead of him. He could finish this fight in the next 2 minutes and reevaluate after. He came into a cross tunnel and paused to confirm a trail. In that second, while his eyes were scouring the ground, the scorplings made their move. 3 of them, all clinging to the roof of the tunnel and hidden with stealth or something similar, dropped down on him. Their tails flashed, stingers whistling through the stale air and ready to deliver their deadly payloads. Velik disappeared from beneath them, and a spear took one of the scorplings through the middle, driving it into the wall. It was dead before the other 2 hit the ground. "You have slain a burning blood assassin scorpling, level 31. Yep, that sounds about right. Damn thing, try to lead me into a trap." He'd been wondering if there were more of them, and if so, when they'd attempt to ambush him. Apex Hunter helped a lot with figuring stuff like that out, and his pause had been deliberate to draw out the attack. Now that he'd finally got a hit on one of the assassin scorplings, he was pleased to see that not only were they smaller, but their armored bodies were much easier to punch through. Phalanx flared to life, not as a light source, but as a cage to prevent the scorplings from scattering back into the dark. They tried to dart around the spears, but Velik cut them off, forcing them back toward him. Seeing no way out, one of the scorplings turned to scuttle toward him. Its tail reared up and forward, but it was no match for his speed. Velik smacked the limb aside and drove his spear through the scorpling's body, right through where he assumed its brain was in relation to its mouth. Whether he'd hit it or not, The damage was severe enough to give him another kill notification. He pulled the weapon free and stepped past its corpse to slay the last of the 3 ambushers. Phalanx has advanced to rank 3. Huh, how about that? Looks like the best way to use this skill is similar to how Shepherd's Cane worked before it merged into Spear Warden. It's not really doing what I wanted from it, but at this point I'd be happy just to merge it and free up the slot so I can try again with something else. With a bar of light from Phalanx guiding him, Velik walked away from the 3 dead assassin scorplings. The one who'd struck him was still alive and had no doubt gained a small lead in the time he'd been occupied killing its friends. That wouldn't last long, and he was wise to their tricks now. One way or another, it was going to die. The assassin scorpling was proving to be more worthy a hunt than Velik had given it credit for. It had been close to an hour now, and the amoral giant bug had stayed ahead of him by leading him on a merry chase through piles of its allies. He lost track of how many monsters he'd killed pursuing that bug, but he hadn't given up. Which is stupid of you, he admonished himself. You might not be lost, but you're letting this thing lead you into ambush after ambush. It's dictating your route, and you're giving it plenty of time to set up traps. On the other hand, he was moving at such an impressive clip, literally scything through enemies before they even realized he was upon them, that none of the traps were all that effective. He hadn't run into any other assassin scorplings, either just the regular ones and a few 6-foot-long centipedes that had no business being in the flesh tunnels. None of them had been higher than level 25, and he didn't even need to use his actual spear to kill them as he ran by. Torwin's harvesting advice came back to him, and he was sure he was leaving a treasure trove of useful parts behind, but he didn't have time to stop. Maybe he'd harvest the venom glands off those assassin scorplings when he was done, assuming he could even find the corpses again. One of the funny little quirks of being duskbound was that he had an almost instinctive awareness of when the sun was going to rise. It wasn't anything as overt as an hourglass in his mind, sand slowly draining and giving him an exact amount of time left, but he could feel that dawn was close, maybe half an hour away at most. The smart move was to retreat, to get away from the monsters that were now crawling through the tunnels and find a place to rest. If he did that, he'd be looking over his shoulder the whole time, just waiting for that scorpling to find him again. The tracks were still clear for now. It was barely keeping ahead of him, but then it had been barely keeping ahead of him for 2 hours now. There was no rational reason to think now was when he'd catch it. If anything, it seemed likely that the monster was deliberately baiting him. He couldn't deny that, regardless of its intentions, he was killing monsters at a ridiculously fast rate. Not having to hunt them down was doing wonders for his time management. No, it's time to give it up. I can't catch it before the sun comes back up, and it's stupid to keep trying. With great reluctance, Velik abandoned his chase and started backtracking toward the surface. He had a complicated mental map of the tunnel complex he was following, one that he'd been refining for hours as they looped around each other, occasionally forming small caves where 5 or 6 all connected at the same hub. He'd only found that one giant cave, and as intent as he'd been on exploring that, he refused to do it with that last assassin scorpling still out there. Something hit the floor behind him with a loud splat, like the world's biggest loogie being spat out. Velik looked over his shoulder, expecting a monster of some sort, but there was nothing there. Frowning, he turned fully to face the direction the noise had come from and scanned the dark. Phalanx generated 2 spears that floated forward 20 feet, letting him see the fine details of the tunnel, other than the flesh having what looked like a long scar running down the wall. Not that unusual a decoration. He'd found there was nothing to see. A quiver in the flesh wall was all the warning he got. Despite everything, it was alive. It could bleed. It responded to stimulus. Something invisible was stuck to it, and the only clue as to its location was a faint sizzling hiss. Even as Velik's ears caught it, the sound cut out. What the hell is going on here? Whatever it was, it probably wasn't that much of a threat. None of the monsters he'd found in here had been individually, with the notable exception of the assassin scorpling. Even those were only a threat because one of them had snuck up on him while he was fighting something else. This plot monster wasn't going to be an issue either. Another wet splat echoed down the tunnel from behind him, this time between him and the way out. The same hissing sound came from over there, but was quickly silenced. A second later, there was a third splat, then two more at the same time. Velik spun in place and rushed away from the sounds. Whatever they were, there were more of them than he wanted to deal with. He ran deeper, stumbling only once when his foot clipped something invisible that had adhered itself to the floor. Even when he glanced at it in the light, he could see nothing. He quickly left the hissing, splattering sound behind and took another tunnel that would lead back to the surface. The layout was confusing, but it did have the fact that there were many routes to the same places going for it. The only problem was that as he approached the intersection he'd been near before, he heard the same sound. Annoyed, he backtracked again and took a third tunnel. This time, there were no noises beyond his own footsteps echoing down the tunnels. For a brief moment, he thought he was clear. Then he ran directly into something solid and invisible. Wincing, he stumbled back a step before reaching a cautious hand out to press against what felt like a solid wall. It had almost no give to it, less so than wood at least. Stone might have been harder, but either way it was solid, and it definitely hadn't been there before. He backed up a few steps, brought his spear up, and slammed it point first into the wall. It skittered across the surface, leaving a strange scratch that seemed to float in the air. Whatever this is, I can break through it. Kinetic charge empowered his next strike, and the spear shattered the wall. Immediately, the faint hissing sound he'd heard before returned 100 times louder. Burning pain erupted across his arm, and he jerked back in surprise. Whatever was coming out of the wall was just as invisible as everything else, but its effect was immediate and obvious. The flesh in the tunnels started blistering, and noxious fumes stung Velik's nose. He retreated from the wall, his arm cradled against his chest. At the same time, a shudder rippled through him as Duskbound failed him. That's it for tonight's run, he thought. And now I'm trapped down here. What even are these walls? The bright side was that unless he attacked one, it didn't seem to do anything but stop him from moving past. The problem was that he wasn't sure how feasible cutting through was going to be if they were going to do whatever the hell it was they did. You have slain an acid brick slime, level 29. You have been awarded 2 Dekarmas. He blinked in surprise. Oh, what now? Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He was truly delighted at the intruder's presence. What had started as an annoyance that had triggered the premature launch of his plans had transformed into something wonderful. It had taken some spine to confirm his suspicions, but now he was sure. His original guardian had finally returned to him after all those years. Even better, he was strong. So strong. It had to have been him who destroyed his most recent guardian a few days ago. All the signs were there, and he'd recognized several of the skills the intruder had used. And then, the unthinkable had happened. The intruder had tried to run away. There was no way that could be allowed. So he quickly whipped up a new type of monster, or rather, a modification on an old type. His flesh slimes had coated his home and congealed into his sensory network years ago, but he needed something a bit more durable if he was going to keep his uninvited guests from leaving. The inspiration to fill them with acidic mist had been genius. Though he thought he knew the limit of his former guardian's power, this was too important to take chances on. Breaching the slime wall's outer structure had indeed been within the intruder's capabilities, but being scorched with acid was making him think twice about brute forcing the issue. He needed the intruder to delve deeper, to keep coming ever closer. His creations lured it in, slowly at first, then quicker when the intruder had fixated on a particular scorpling. At first, he'd been concerned about the poison, but his former guardian had proven resourceful enough to make a full recovery. Delightful. Truly, he thought to himself again. He was so taken with the turn of events that all of his hands had grown still for the first time he could remember. Flesh withered under his care, completely abandoned and forgotten. He needed to see what the intruder would do next, needed the intruder to come to him. There would be no retreat. It was only a matter of time. Velik sat with his back against the wall, his spear laid out next to his leg, and took shallow breaths as he watched the hallway through half-closed eyes. For 2 days now, he'd been fighting an unending battle with the monsters that filled the bizarre underground labyrinth. There was no peace. There were no safe rooms. He got what rest he could a few minutes at a time, never more than lightly dozing. Truthfully, he didn't need to sleep yet. His high physical could keep him going for a few more days before that became a problem, but the lack of food and water was starting to get to him. He'd had a little bit on him when he'd come in. That was gone now, and he wasn't at the point where eating raw monster meat sounded better than starving. He'd survive one way or another. If he'd killed less than 1,000 monsters in the last 2 days, he'd be surprised. His Dekarma counter on his status certainly supported the idea that it had been a wholesale slaughter, and he was sure he was getting close to leveling up again. Apex Hunter had advanced a rank for a few hours ago, when he'd successfully fended off an ambush of 8 monstrous centipedes that had crawled out of the flesh covering the ground. For all that he'd accomplished, however, what he hadn't done was find the source. More and more walls had popped up to seal him off from the surface. Always an invisible membrane that ate the skin off his arm if he did any sort of damage to it. His spear survived, but not unscathed. Mending was working hard to keep it in good shape. It was all to herd him into a trap. He'd become convinced of that. Every time he encountered an enemy by itself or in a group, every time he found another wall blocking his way, there was always a path of retreat. Always, that large cavern at the bottom was waiting for him to step foot inside. He wanted to force the issue, but the constant stream of enemies hunting for him just kept getting worse. There had to be an end to them. There couldn't be an infinite number of monsters living underground. But Velik was afraid he'd find the bottom of his own endurance first. He needed to get free and retreat, but by now, all the ways out were sealed off. Phalanx couldn't break through, not even enhanced with kinetic charge. About 20 minutes after Velik sat down, he heard the squishy scratching of scorpions moving in his direction. His eyes snapped open, and he was on his feet in an instant, ready for the next fight. By the time they actually found him, it was too late to set up any sort of ambush. Velik slaughtered them. Then he was off, running through the dark again and trying to kill as many monsters as he could to thin their numbers. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Torwin was breathing hard when he finally reached D-Shur. He'd made excellent time. Even taking a few risks, he normally wouldn't have to cut down the total distance of the trip, and he was eager to find his apprentice. The message Jensen had sent him mentioned both reaching the level 20 threshold to unlock a new skill slot and receiving class evolution options. He hoped Jensen hadn't already made irreversible decisions without Torwin there to offer input. The young nobleman was still stubbornly insistent on charting a course to a destination Torwin doubted he'd ever reach, and this was probably the best, maybe only, chance he'd ever have to steer his apprentice in a direction more suited to his talents and temperament. He was still half a mile from the village when he paused to study it. There was a smell in the air, mostly blood and entrails, but something else too. It was like rotten fruit and moldy grains mixed together and stuffed into an animal carcass, except not really any of those things. What happened here? There were still people living in the town, all of them ignoring the stink. He hadn't paid much attention to the townsfolk when he'd come through asking questions, but he thought he recognized several of the faces. Presumably, those were the seed-bearers Jensen had mentioned in his Whispering Wind message. Whatever battle had taken place for control of the town, they'd obviously won. He circled the outside of D-Shur, looking for clues as to what had happened to everyone else. The way Torwin saw it, they'd either been driven out or they'd been killed. It was possible they were still trapped in the town, but that didn't feel right with what he knew about monster behavior. Then again, the seed-bearers were a very unique type of infiltrator, one he'd never seen the likes of before. He really couldn't be sure of anything without more information. He found the tracks of a great deal of people, at least 300, leading into the woods from the south gate. Survivors, maybe pursuers? If he were a group of frontier-hardened townsfolk fleeing their homes after losing them to an invasion of body-snatching monsters, he went ahead for the nearest bastion of civilization he could find. In this case, that probably meant Beldred. Just to be safe, he did a full lap around D-Shur, but there were no tracks in any appreciable numbers going in other directions. The survivors had left a trail of trampled brush a blind man could follow in the forest. There was plenty of dry blood, too, which he took to mean their exodus hadn't been uncontested. On 4 separate occasions over the next half an hour, he found bodies left where they'd fallen with gaping, bloody wounds in them. Some had been picked at by local scavengers, but they were all still recognizably human. All told, he traveled about 15 miles before he found a makeshift encampment made of felled trees and salvaged cloth. A local huntsman intercepted Torwin as he approached, the man having been hiding behind a clump of bushes just off the side of the trail. "Hold!" he called out as he popped up, an arrow aimed Torwin's way. The old ranger cocked an eyebrow at him. He'd already spotted the huntsman and used Identify on him 500 feet back, and knew he was only level 14. Still, it was admirable that the man was working as a sentry for the encampment and placing himself in danger to get between them and an intruder. "I'm looking for my apprentice, a young man by the name of Jensen," Torwin said. "Is he here? How do I know you're not infected?" The huntsman yelled back, his arrow never wavering from Torwin's chest. "If I was, I hardly think I'd be stopping to answer questions. Hard to say what those monsters would or wouldn't do. They're good at pretending to be human. Are they that good at it? I need to get the full story out of Jensen. This could be worse than I thought." "I'm going in now," Torwin said. "If my apprentice isn't here, I'll do what I can to help your group, but then I have to go find him." The huntsman moved out of the brush, but didn't relax his draw on his bow. "No sudden movements. I'll be watching you the whole way, if that's what makes you comfortable," Torwin told him placidly. He could understand having an overabundance of caution, given what the town had gone through, but it really was laughable that any of them thought they could do anything to him. Pretending to be on the same level as civilians was an old game that he and all the other high-ranking monster hunters played. It helped keep politicians and government officials calm to pretend they had some sort of power over the high levels. The encampment was a ragged thing. More people huddled under the boughs of trees than with any real sort of shelter. That was strange to him. The frontiers were all logging towns, and he would have expected them to be able to build some sort of basic lodge, even if it was all rough-hewn wood. The huntsman cast him a dark, suspicious glance, and moved past him to whisper to another man in what he probably thought was too soft a voice for Torwin to hear. Dutifully, he pretended not to be able to pick up the words, but inwardly he smiled when he heard the man say, "He says Jensen is his apprentice. I think this is the monster hunter the town's hired last month. Can you go get him for me while I keep an eye on the guy?" The second man ran off, and the huntsman moved close again. "It's going to rain soon," Torwin said casually. "What will you all do tonight?" He was no stranger to getting rained on, but he was willing to bet the average physical of the people spread out around him was single digits, and he saw more than a few injuries that had been roughly treated with ragged strips of cloth instead of given any real medical attention. "Got a few hours until nightfall," the huntsman replied. "We'll get some help before then. Don't you worry about the details. Food's probably a bigger concern than keeping the rain off them for the moment, but they'll care about the weather soon enough. There's no way to tan the hides fast enough, but a herd of deer could provide enough leather to stitch together something to keep the rain off. I could probably bring something back in an hour or two." While he was musing over what exactly the battered group of refugees needed to survive, a familiar face emerged from the far side of the encampment. He paused when he saw Torwin, then let out a great sigh of relief. "There you are," Jensen said as he hurried across the open ground.